Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Jennifer smiled at me warmly. She had become like an ineffaceable part of the family, with her regular visits to our farmhouse every single day. In truth, I was heartily grateful for her gregarious, vivacious and zestful presence around our home. She was so upbeat, high-spirited and positive, the kind of person who always sees the good side in everything, when things are invariably bleak, foreboding and very overcast. In my case, things were on a downhill turn. My life had spiralled out of control, with my wife's devastating diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. One moment she had been so well. The next minute she was confined to her bed and was receiving full-time hospice care from home, with two nurses who alternated in their duties. Jennifer worked as a daytime nurse, and Ella was her nighttime carer. My wife refused to be hospitalized. Who can blame her? "I don't care how long I've got left," she'd exclaimed. "That's not significant. But what I care about most is ending my life journey at home." Me and my wife had lived in this farmhouse for over 50 years. The farmhouse had been given to us as a gift from my wife's father when we first got married, as we'd both hankered after a rural way of life and had never ever looked back. Ostensibly, I grew peanuts on my Georgian farm on the coastal plain south of the Fall Line, running from Columbus through to Macron and Augusta, where I was rotating peanuts with cottons, peas and sweet potatoes, which helps protect the plants from diseases, enhancing the nutrient content of the soil. Our business had boomed. I loved living in a rustic rural environment like this, where the sun beat down upon my brow, while a cool, invigorating breeze nuzzled my cheeks affectionately. I couldn't envisage a life where I was stuffed away in a cramped, confined office all day. As the Cherokee saying goes, "A man separated from nature becomes hard," of which I heartily agree. I couldn't put it more eloquently myself. Our charming, symmetrical white-brick farmhouse, with its imposing grey slate roof, was nestled in the heart of a beguiling valley, where on either side of the house were two statuesque oak trees that shaded the area with their umbrella-like branches. There was a sumptuous, perfectly manicured front and back lawn, dispersed with pretty perennial flower beds, along with an attractive rose garden, while the extended yard boasted a few pretty flowering bushes, along with a scattering of indigenous trees. The house had been modernized in recent years, so that the lower floor was comprised of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked exquisite viridescent green views of the countryside. The house was hugged by a large wraparound porch with wooden decking and sumptuous outdoor furnishings. The upper floor of our house was more contained, with 3 medium-sized windows that emerged conspicuously or jutted out through the grey slate roof, with little roof coverings of their own over each window. You accessed our enchanting property through a large rusty iron gate, worn away from years of exposure to the elements, with a visible conspicuous carved sign that read "The Squirrel's Friend," which was the name for our peanut farm, which was very appropriate, as I ain't met a squirrel yet that didn't thoroughly enjoy eating peanuts. There were a fair few pilferaged every year by our furry friends, but our peanut production was so prolific it never presented a problem. Besides, I always made allowances for the wildlife, as I believe intrinsically in living in harmony with nature. You would follow a long asphalt driveway on our property through an undulating resplendent green valley that was perfectly aligned with neat rows of green peanut plants, and then you would drive past a large grove of peaches, a meadow with barns and stables where a few of our horses would frolic away happily under the pleasant warmth of the noonday sun. To the rear of our property was a splendiferous long-leaf pine forest that smelt of pine, with slender trunks that penciled up into the sky like sylph-like willowy giants, and amidst this sizable forest was a scattering of substantial mature oak trees. This sanctuary was an idyllic oasis for the indigenous wildlife, made all the more desirable by a fabulous stream that meandered through this valley, over some spectacular sculptural rocky outcrops. The woodland space had become my treasured sanctuary, now more than ever after my wife's devastating diagnosis. It was my quintessential escapism, if you like, where I would walk through the forest and try to allow the thoughts of my wife's illness to abandon my mind like a bird on the wind. I know that nature can sometimes be cruel and hard, but she can also be remarkably compassionate and empathetic, offering up the extravagant wonders of the natural world to you, rather like a king's banquet, upon which you can gratefully dine. So when I was in the woods, all my senses were stimulated, from my sense of smell to sound, and of course my visual appreciation. I would find I would return home renewed, invigorated, restored. It was something about the whispering trees, the crashing sounds of the water thundering over the rocks, that pacified me, soothed me, enabled me to find peace and solace. It's almost like the natural world wipes away your tears, gives you an inner strength that you never knew you had, that enables you to fight another day. Without those daily energizing walks in the woodgrove, I'm pretty certain I would have fallen apart a long time ago. "How's the patient doing?" I asked Jennifer, who was making me a hot cup of tea in our country-style kitchen, with its cream range and more modern white granite countertops. "Alice is doing well today. It's one of her good days, I'm glad to say. But she's continually exhausted all the time. But then that is expected in the circumstances. That's the problem with cancer. It can be so draining." I sighed wearily. "I hate death. I can never get my head around it, even as a farmer. I think losing Alice is going to be a grueling ordeal for me. Watching her wasting away like this, withering like a flower in the meadows, is not easy." "Of course it's not easy, Hugh. It never is. Dying isn't easy, especially for the ones left behind," said Jennifer, reaching out to squeeze my arm encouragingly. "But death is as much a part of life as birth. When I first got involved as a hospice nurse, it seemed such a daunting prospect, having to help a patient through the dying process, as we all react to it so differently, don't we? Some patients are so angry, they feel desperately cheated. Others accept their impending fate so gracefully, much like your wife Alice is doing. For me, becoming a hospice nurse happened by chance, actually. I was thrown into the deep end, as there was one nurse short at the hospice, so I was asked to fill in for the hospice on a temporary basis. You could say I was thrown in with the sharks into the deep end. I remember thinking, this is not what I signed up for. Actually, in truth, I felt really peeved off, as I didn't become a nurse to exit people from life, but to make them recover, to make them get better, of course. That was the whole idea of becoming a nurse, wasn't it? When I began working with dying patients, I realised what an incredible privilege it was to look after people on their last and final journey through life. These dying patients taught me a lot, I can tell you, Hugh. They made me appreciate the value of every single day. They made me begin to realise that sweating the small stuff is a complete waste of time. Now I would never want to return to regular nursing, not even for a moment. Working with the dying means I get to meet people like you, which is an absolute honour." "How old are you, Jennifer?" I asked her. "I'm 35. Young, I know, for a hospice nurse, but I so enjoy my job." "Do you believe in life after death?" I asked her. "You can be straight with me. I won't take any offence. What I'm trying to say is that after Alice dies, do you think I'll ever see her again? Or do you think this is it? That's what I want to know." You know, it's a funny thing. Until I worked with the dying, I didn't believe in God. I was of the opinion that if there was a God, why was there so much suffering in the world? I believed that once you died, it was all over. There was nothing more beyond that. My mother's seriously religious. She was frustrated with me about that, claiming that if I didn't believe in God, that my atheism would drive me to the gates of hell, where my soul would be damned for all eternity, that I would be left to burn within the fiery flames. "Oh dear, that's a bleak outlook indeed," I said. Well, I didn't pay much attention to my mother's rambles. However, when I worked with dying patients, strange things began to happen that I couldn't ignore. Like what? Well, very often on the day the person that I was taking care of was going to die, they became, let's just say, compos mentos, when days before they'd been rarely out for the count. Often the patient would tell me that they were hungry. I would bring them something to eat. They would eat a lot. Then they would talk to their relatives. I was to later learn that this is known as the golden hour, where you can say your goodbyes to your loved ones. Many of my patients claimed to see deceased relatives that they said were picking them up to take them directly to heaven. If this had happened once, I would have called it a fluke. But it happened over and over and over and over again, countless hundreds of times. So yes, I'm inclined to think that the soul can never die. One of my friends, she's also a hospice nurse, I have to say, she physically saw an orb flying out of the patient's nose at the very moment of death. She emphatically believed she had a glimpse of the human soul. It was a sobering thought, as many say that the soul is in our brain. So then it would make sense if it exits through the nose. Thank you, Jennifer. That makes me feel a whole lot better. I do like to think we live forever. Otherwise, what's the point in anything? Because life on this earth is far too short. Well, I'm not saying all this to make you feel better, Hugh, Jennifer assured me. I'm telling you exactly what I know. My conclusion is that we don't die. So there we are, I've said it. And yes, I do think you'll see your wife again. In fact, I'm pretty certain you will. Well, I'm going to reflect over this on a walk, I told Jennifer. I'm going into the wood grove. It helps me to relax. Good for you. It's a very good idea. Take as long as you like, Hugh. Your wife is in my safe hands. She'll probably be needing a wee bit more morphine. I'll read her a story. That tends to calm her down. Helps her to sleep like a baby, it does. Oh, I'm in no doubt, Jennifer, that she's in the very best hands under your charge, I said, giving her a mischievous wink. I was so appreciative for her amiable vitality in our home. She made us laugh so much with her quirky, generous sense of humour. It had made the dying process a whole lot more uncomplicated and less dauntingly oppressive. I began my daily walk towards the woodgrove. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day that is so radiant that it's hard to imagine that there is anything bad going on in the world. I breathed in the fresh air, sipping it gratefully as it renewed my hope, restored my languishing strength. Somehow being close to nature helped me expunge all the current challenges in my life, lay them to rest without dwelling on them too much. As I entered the woodgrove, a bright little squirrel with large brown eyes watched me curiously as he nibbled away on an acorn. I was amazed by how tame he appeared. For a moment I stood still, rather like a marble statue, staring at the little creature. Finally he dashed up a branch and was gone from my sight. I could hear the pleasing chirrups, tweets, whistles and warbles of the bird's song. This enchanting sound tranquilized, mollified, soothed my troubled soul, rather like a band-aid on an inflamed, open wound. I smiled happily as a flock of rather social quails swept through the leaf litter on the ground with sideways movements. Then I could hear the crashing sound of the water thundering majestically over the rocks. I sat down on a large voluptuous boulder on the water's edge, paddling my feet into the water. I began to skim a few pebbles across it, something I'd done a lot as a boy. I often would wish as I threw a stone, rather like throwing a coin in the Trevi fountain in Italy. My mind was not short of wishes. These wishes of mine, without exception, were big. "Feel better?" asked Jennifer, after I returned from my walk in the woods. "You seem to be positively glowing. I can see the colours return to your cheeks. Come and see the patient. She's eager to see you." "I do feel much better," I admitted. It's being outdoors in the fresh air. It does you a world of good. I entered my wife's bedroom. She was sitting upright against several puffed-up pink floral pillows, smiling at me brightly, like the warm sunshine. For a fleeting second she looked so much like her old self. You could be forgiven for believing she wasn't dying at all. How I wished that was true, and that my wish at the water's edge could come to pass. But wishes were like whispers on the wind. Still one can dream, hang on to hope. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" I said to my wife, giving her a large, affectionate kiss on the cheeks. "I'm feeling quite good today, actually." "You're not looking bad yourself, sweetheart," she said, taking my hand in hers. "Now you listen to me, and you listen good. I may be dying, but this does not mean you should stop living. You hear that? I want you to live every single day to the fullest. Grieving is a waste of time. Being sad is so pointless, it's futile." "You're right, sweetheart," I said, stroking her hand. "It's difficult to be happy, though, when I know you're in pain." "Nonsense! My pain is being managed perfectly. Jennifer's doing a sterling job, so don't you worry your head about that." That evening the night nurse Ella arrived to take care of my wife for night duty. I sat up in the living room to watch some light-hearted television. Then I retired to bed. I woke up later that night, sweating profusely. I was having a distressing nightmare about my wife's impending death. Hence I couldn't sleep easily at all. I was restlessly tossing and turning. I quickly climbed out of bed. I started pacing up and down the bedroom, rather like a frustrated animal in a zoo enclosure. I thought I was coming to terms with my wife's death, but now I wasn't quite so sure about that. It was apparent that the idea of being widowed had hit me hard like a brick to the head. It appeared to be haunting my most lucid nightmares. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:30 at night. I couldn't get any sleep. The turbulent, fretful restlessness I felt was all-consuming. It monopolized my every thought. There really was no point in going back to bed. Then I had an inspirational idea. Why not take a leisurely walk in the woodgrove? So what if it was late at night, I thought. Why should that matter in the slightest? On the contrary, it could be fun. It would be far better than twiddling my thumbs with an unrestful insomnia, desperately battling to get some quality sleep that would elude me. I grabbed my rifle, threw on some warm clothes, put on a headlamp and ventured out of doors. Funny enough, I could feel an exhilarating thump in my heart as an excited flurry began whisking through my body like white fluffy meringues. I'm not sure I can remember the last time I actually took a walk at night. I could already feel my agitated tension lifting off me like a hot air balloon, sailing away in the wind, floating up into the fluffy white clouds. By all accounts, it was a fabulously beautiful night, with a cool breeze blowing. It would seem the gentle, invigorating, stirring air revitalized and uplifted me, especially since moments before I'd been soaked in the heat of my own sweat. I glanced up at the vast firmament, lost in the marvellous wonder of the silvery clusters of stars that adorned the sky like sparkling diamonds, while an almost full moon dappled the night with a gentle, silvery, ethereal light that cast its soft shadows on the fauna and fauna. As I embarked upon my journey or adventure into the woodgrove, I was welcomed by the animated, cheerful chorus of the crickets and frogs, the hoots of owls, the occasional yapping sounds of neighbourhood dogs. I disturbed about 6 raccoons on the run that scattered the moment they saw me. I wondered if they would have done the same if my wife had been here. Probably not. I'm almost certain they would have recognised her. I smiled as over the years my wife had enjoyed feeding the raccoons. She adored their distinctive black patches on their eyes that made them look like mischievous rascals or black-eyed bandits that were up to no good. My wife had successfully tamed some of those raccoons that had been eating out of her hands for many long years. These little buggers took one look at me and decided they needed to abscond from my presence, bulleting away through the forest faster than greased lightning. As I walked, I could hear the crashing sound of the water thrashing and colliding viciously over the rocks. Then the sound of the night seemed to mute. The crickets and frogs stopped singing, almost as if they were holding their breaths for a moment. It was as if someone had intentionally switched off the background music for a brief reprieve or interval, if you like. In a trice, things became inauspiciously quiet, with, of course, the exception of the water that continued to make its thunderous assault over the rocks, with no respite. I could see the wind had picked up its unrelenting speed as it whistled through the tall long-leaf pines. They jiggled their needled boughs furiously, as if engaged in the quick-step ballroom dance. Their swift swinging movements seemed baleful and menacing, almost as if the trees themselves, if they didn't happen to be anchored in the ground and stationary, they themselves would choose to eagerly run away in trepidation from this ominous night. An ill-boding premonition seized me like a quick warning squeeze or nudge on the shoulders, giving me the distinct impression that a predator was loitering in the dark shadows. That was when I heard the blood-curdling screams that sent the fear of God coursing through my veins like a hunter's hot bullet searing through flesh. It sounded as if a woman was screaming out in agonizing pain as she was being savagely murdered. Not to put too fine a point on it, I didn't hesitate to run towards the direful, unearthly noise, for I was driven by a desperate yearning, a need to rescue this woman that was being hurt. I had visions of some deranged, unhinged man trying to bludgeon his wife to death in our wood grove, thinking that he could get away with the grisly murder in some remote forest where he was unlikely to be seen or heard. This would not be the first, nor the last time that such a nefarious, duplicitous crime had occurred in our forest. 3 years prior, in our wood grove, a man had killed his wife here. The whole area had been cordoned off with crime scene tape. I had been alerted to the scene when I had heard the horrifying screams from the woman. I had run to her help, while her husband had absconded in his truck, with me running behind him, firing random shots after him. But to no avail. He had got away, but luckily not for long. The police finally caught up with him in the end. When I arrived to check on the poor woman, she was long since deceased, although her body was still warm. It had been a harrowing experience for me, one that had haunted me and my wife for quite some time. You never come to terms with an event like that, do you? We were to learn that the husband had secretly witnessed his wife in bed with her lover. He had not confronted her with his knowledge of her infidelity, but had deliberately made his presence known in the house with his booming voice, so that his wife's lover escaped naked from her bedroom porch to the street. He then suggested to his wife they go for a quiet, peaceful drive in the countryside together, along with a leisurely walk that involved a wee bit of trespassing, but then why not? Such was the insatiable fury of the woman's aggrieved husband, who was so filled with an incandescent rage that forgiveness was estranged from him and knew no welcome in his heart. So he cunningly lured his defensive, ignorant, naive wife, like a lamb to the slaughter, out of his truck. In haste, without any application of second thought, and no willingness to engage in regret, the husband shot his wife of 20 years at point-blank range to extract his ultimate revenge. His fury was out of control. It could not be calmed, pacified, or subdued. Now it was happening all over again. The signs were written on the wind like invisible words. I could feel the familiar anger coursing through my veins. I was determined this time the man would not escape in his truck like he had before, whoever he was. In my mind's eye, this insidious event from 3 years prior was now replaying its malignant, acrimonious tune in my life all over again. But this time things would be different, very different. I promptly decided that if needs must, I would shoot the man in order to save the impuissant, poor, defenceless woman. Something instinctively made me slow down as I drew very close to the screaming woman. Perhaps I was secretly concerned that the irate husband would turn his rifle upon me, for there is no telling what a man will do when his sanity and sense has evaded him. I surreptitiously went to hide behind the large stump of an old oak tree, where I could study the proceedings with a judicious assessment, but what I saw made me recoil in horror. There were 2 female creatures engaged in an antagonistic, aggressive brawl. This was not what I'd envisaged seeing. I'm not sure exactly what they were fighting over, possibly a male. Who knows? I knew at once what these creatures were. They were both Bigfoot, but this was an unfair fight in every single regard. It was like David fighting Goliath, as the one creature looked startlingly like an ape in her facial features. She was easily over 9 foot tall, 800 pounds, covered in a tawny brown-coloured hair, with large pillowy breasts that hung low upon her chests like two wilting, sagging pawpaws, and with eyes as red as blazing traffic lights. The other creature was about 7 foot tall and 500 pounds, and although she was impressively large, she was dwarfed by this creature. Imagine my astonishment when I discovered her face appeared to be so human, her deep-set eyes dark, intelligent, and kind. In my humble, wizened opinion, I was watching a Herculean hairy ape-man fighting a hairy wild woman. That is what seemed to be happening, although they were both unequivocally Bigfoot. I stood there watching this enigmatic fight unfold before my eyes, like a movie director assessing a clip in an esoteric movie. But this was real. I was pontificating, speculating what kind of course of action I should take. Should I intercede, or should I not? I had huge reservations, for this 9 foot ape-like creature looked volatile, treacherously dangerous. I wouldn't hesitate to suggest that if I fired at her, she would seize me in a second without flinching, before I could shoot her again. I would be viciously killed with one strike of her mighty hand that was as forceful as a garden trowel. I was in no doubt about that. I stood there like a spectator watching a blood sport, when in bygone times people came to watch a fight to the death with cockfighting or dogs. I could feel my heart racing through my chest violently. I could discern every single beat, while an incongruous icy-cold sweat began to trail down my face, like slow raindrops dribbling down a glass pane. The large ape-like humanoid was screaming like a banshee, an ear-piercing sound that would make glass shatter, it was so discomposing. She was pouncing on the smaller Bigfoot, using her large, powerful feet, lunging with her legs. She lifted those legs to chest level, using them like deadly weapons. She managed to get the wild woman on the ground. She was hitting at her with her powerful, forceful thrusts, using her feet all the time. She managed to cause open wounds on the little Bigfoot. The Bigfoot was physically bleeding. The wild woman whimpered. Everything went deadly quiet. The huge ape-like creature kicked the wild woman one more time to see if she would move. She didn't react. All was still. Once satisfied that her foe was indeed dead, the large ape-like Bigfoot glided away. She disappeared into the heart of the forest, leaving behind a ghastly stench that reminded me of sulphur. I immediately ran up to the lump of bloodied hair lying on the ground, feeling certain that this Bigfoot was dead, beyond my help. A small part of me wished I had possessed the courage to shoot at that nasty large Bigfoot, but an overwhelming terror had seized control over my ability to react, rendering me helpless and inefficacious in every regard. I ran over to the Bigfoot, my heart sinking, realizing to my astonishment that the creature was still alive, but blood was pouring profusely out of her leg at an alarming rate. It didn't look good. The prognosis was bleak. I knew if I didn't stop the bleeding, she would be dead in seconds, literally seconds. Those kind of injuries are notoriously fatal, without efficient, super-fast intervention. It was fortunate, as before I ever met my wife, I had done a short stint as an EMT on the beat, so I knew a thing or two about first aid and prompt application. I tore my shirt and made a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. I then managed to get my ATV to the scene, using a drag chain and plastic taupe to roll the creature onto it, which I managed to drag back home. How I did this I am not sure, but against all odds, with a great deal of heavy breathing, I managed to get a badly injured Bigfoot back to my farmhouse in one piece. Ella, the nurse on duty taking care of my wife, helped me to drag the taupe into the downstairs bedroom, where we rolled the creature onto one of those pop-up double mattresses low on the floor. But the Bigfoot helped us manoeuvre her, even though she was very out of it all. The nurse didn't ask me any awkward questions. She just went to work efficiently and quickly like a pro. She disinfected the creature's wounds, administering first aid, stitching up open wounds to stop bleeding, and giving the creature medication and painkillers. She knew exactly what she was doing. She'd worked in accident and emergency for 10 long years before, eventually branching out into hospice care. Once the Bigfoot was stable and heavily sedated, Ella asked me hundreds of questions, none of which I could answer. "You found a Bigfoot? That's extraordinary. What happened?" "Well, I went for a walk in the wood grove. I heard a woman screaming. I thought she was being murdered by an aggrieved husband. It's happened here before on our land. So I ran to the scene at once. But I was very cautious when I got up close to the commotion, in case the husband was inebriated or off his head. You do have to be cautious in this regard. When I arrived on the scene, let's just say I was gobsmacked. There is no other word to use. It was two Bigfoot fighting each other, but they were strikingly different. So different, like a dog is from a cat. One looked like a huge human-like ape, the other one like a wild woman. The Bigfoot looked like he wanted to kill the wild woman. "Really? That's extraordinary," said Ella reflectively. "You don't suppose they might have different species, do you? The one we have here is so human-looking." "Wow, I never thought about that. I suppose that would make a lot of sense. The ape-like Bigfoot was as mean as hell. Never seen such a nasty-looking face. I think she believed this Bigfoot was dead, as the Bigfoot didn't even flinch when she kicked her." "Clever girl. Maybe she played dead. That's what I would do in a situation like that, when I'm being overpowered and subdued by an oppressor. By all accounts, these creatures are remarkably clever. Let's face it, if they've managed to avoid our detection for years and years. Up until now, I personally never knew Bigfoots were real." "Neither did I. But more to the point, do you think the creature is going to be all right?" "Well, there's a good chance, isn't there? That she'll be fine thanks to you. If you hadn't applied the tourniquet to the femoral artery here on the upper thigh, close to the groin, she would have bled out so fast and almost certainly died. So if she pulls through, it's thanks to you. I will say this, though. She's been beaten up rather badly, but I can see her body is much more robust than ours is, so she could recuperate rather well. A creature like this with such an awesome build is inclined to be much more resilient. If she was a 170-pound human being with these kind of injuries, she would definitely be dead. I need to ask you a favour, Ella. You can't breathe a word of this to anyone." "As if," said Ella, raising a brow. "I want this Bigfoot to get better. Do you think I'm going to go around telling people we're nursing a Bigfoot? It's a guarantee that this Bigfoot would never recover if that was the case, so you can be assured of my discretion. I won't tell anybody about it even after the creature's healed." In the days that followed, with the sagacious help of Jennifer during the day and Ella at night, the Bigfoot female was well on the way to recovering. I remember the first time she opened her deep-set dark eyes. She looked up at me. She was bewildered and surprised that she was still alive. She lifted the sheet that was covering her body to examine her wounds. She pointed to me and then at her wounds as if to say, "Did you help me?" "Yes," I said. "I saw the fight. I put a tourniquet onto your wound to stop the bleeding." I pulled the sheet back to demonstrate to her exactly what I meant. She nodded and looked up at me with the kindest, most beautiful, appreciative, deep-set dark eyes that I've ever seen, that were so full of gratitude. I marvelled at how intelligent she was. She admitted to me that she had played dead when the creature had been attacking her. I handed her a book of paper and a pencil, and through a series of drawings I deduced why the fight had occurred in the first place. From what I could discern or deduce from my interaction with this female Bigfoot that was recuperating under my roof, is that Bigfoots that have ape-like facial features readily despise those that look very human. They feel intimidated and threatened by those that have more human-like features, for the human-looking Bigfoots are far superior in their intelligence. They are peace-loving and gentle, always eager to help those in trouble. But those that look more like apes, usually with bright red eyes, are violent and aggressive. Over many generations, the different Bigfoot species have been at war with each other. Many of the ape-like Bigfoot males have notoriously tried to abduct Bigfoot females that look human in order to procreate with them, as they found them attractive and would like to procure more human-like features in their rudimentary, crude DNA. Failing that, they've tried to abduct human women with less success. The female Bigfoot who told me her name was Ayana, which means eternal blossom, told me in a series of drawings that the female Bigfoot that had tried to kill her had her sights set on a big strapping male in her tribe, whom had made no secret that he was interested in abducting Ayana to make her his wife so that she could birth his offspring. The female Bigfoot was determined to eliminate the competition. This would mean she could seduce the Bigfoot male in her clan for herself with a greater chance of success. It would seem she would stop at nothing to attain her goal, even if it meant killing Ayana, which is exactly what she tried to do. Over the next few days, Ayana got stronger and stronger. My wife was always asking about her. When I told her I'd saved the Bigfoot's life, she was thrilled. I explained that Ayana had been embroiled in a fight with a dangerous Bigfoot female, as the big male she wanted for herself had his sights set on Ayana. The Bigfoot female had tried to kill Ayana in the hope that the male would turn his attentions upon her. "That's most unfortunate," my wife piped. "What happens if the Bigfoot female discovers that Ayana did not die? Surely she'll come after her again, try and kill her. It would seem her heart is set on the male in her clan. She will eliminate all the female competition until she gets her man." I tried to explain my wife's misgivings to Ayana about how when she was fully recovered, the female would try and kill her again. But Ayana assured me that she would join another Bigfoot clan, who were human-like like her, but lived much further afield, in order to escape her jealous oppressor. It was after a week of rest and feeding up the Bigfoot with plenty of fruit and peanut butter sandwiches that she loved that she was to make a full recovery. She indicated that before she left, she wanted to sit down with my wife, as she had learnt about my wife's illness. My wife was fast asleep when Ayana entered the room, but she sat up and smiled when she saw the Bigfoot. "Hello, Ayana. My husband's told me all about you. I'm so thrilled to see you. I'm so glad you're better. Thank you so much for visiting me." Ayana sat at the end of her bed, looking lovingly at my wife with tender eyes, reaching out to hold her hand. I gasped when I saw my wife's hand in the Bigfoot's huge hands, as her hands looked like that of a tiny porcelain doll by contrast. I was amazed because although Ayana never said anything to my wife, the Bigfoot engaged with her in private telepathic conversation. I noticed my wife was profoundly moved emotionally by Ayana. She was nodding, her eyes filling with happy tears. She smiled joyfully. The Bigfoot nodded at me, touched me on the shoulders gently as if to say thank you for everything you've done for me. Then she indicated to me that she needed to go. She also patted Ella on the back. We led her to our front door. She nodded at us one more time, her eyes filled with so much gratitude. We waved goodbye to her. We watched her gliding through the trees. I marvelled at her grace. It was hard to believe that she had ever been injured. She moved her legs with a seamless fluidity that made it appear as if she was floating on ice. It was now my turn to physically cry. Tears welled up in my eyes. I was surprised to see that Ella was crying too. That was how much this Bigfoot had moved the both of us. "Not you as well," I said to Ella. "Look at us blubbing away like great big babies. Why are you crying?" "Because," said Ella, "in all my years of nursing, I've never nursed such a grateful patient. And there was something about her presence that filled your home with such a warm, convivial energy, which your wife could feel before she even met the Bigfoot. It was such a privilege to nurse her back to health. When me and Ella went into my wife's bedroom, I asked my wife what the Bigfoot had said to her. It seemed like she was speaking to you telepathically. What was she saying?" My wife smiled. "She was showing me pictures of heaven, the place I'll go to once I leave here," she said. "I'll be going there next Tuesday, but not to be afraid, that's what she was telling me, because it's a very beautiful place." The Bigfoot was right on the money, for the following Tuesday my wife died peacefully in her sleep. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Lilac Evans was wearing a wide-brimmed navy blue straw hat on this lazy summer's afternoon, and armed with a razor-sharp pair of pruning shears, she began to deadhead her vast beds of beautiful fragrant roses, a pretty mix of reds, pinks, lilacs, peaches, yellows and whites. Bees and colourful butterflies frolicked lackadaisically from one bloom to another, caught up in their own little idyllic world. The weather was a scorcher today, and Lilac wondered why it was that some people loved hot weather like this. It was far too overrated as far as she was concerned. She could feel the sweat gathering under her armpits, saturating the fabric of her cool cotton top. Beads of perspiration dribbled down her back, making her feel as if she was sitting in a sauna. Lilac loathed this uncongenial sticky heat, and of late the weather had been unabashedly humid. Even in their small town, Lilac had noticed people looking worn out and fatigued by the insufferable hot weather that seemed to refuse to abate. Whether it was global warming or not, she couldn't be sure, but the heat these days appeared to be getting significantly worse. Or was it because she was getting older? The latter did not bear thinking about, as Lilac did not like to think about her age. As far as she was concerned, age was only a number and a state of mind. Besides, she was in her late 50s now, considering herself to still be reasonably young. There was life in the old dog yet. Ostensibly, New York State was renowned for being humidly subtropical. It was speculated that it was slowly transitioning into a humid continental climate. Lilac lived in a rural area far from New York City, but still within the borders of New York State. It's an area of 54,550 square miles. The state itself is larger than England. It would seem the cruel summer heat had shown absolutely no mercy. It had been unrelentless in its wrath, that it had inflicted so cruelly on the environment, so that plants in the neighbourhood looked scorched and bedraggled. People's yards were deflated. It was hot, tiring work in the yard, at the hottest time of the day. Even Lilac's golden retriever Buddy had more sense than to expose himself to the hostile, bright glare that the sun invited. Buddy was avoiding the searing heat, very sensibly and wisely lying under the shade of a large sycamore tree to keep himself cool. It was through dark, sleepy eyes that he would watch Lilac as she bustled busily around the roses, and occasionally he'd drift off into a contented, deep sleep. His days seemed to consist of numerous little doggy siestas that increased as the weather continued to soar. There wasn't a soul out on the street or on the neighbourhood at this time of day. People had wisely taken refuge in their houses to keep themselves away from the wrath of the midday sun. But Lilac was doggedly determined that even on this hot day, and especially because of it, she needed to ensure her roses got enough water, for she would not allow those roses to lose their glory. Lilac was devoted to keeping her yard looking pristine, and it was the envy of the entire neighbourhood. She had bewitching beds overflowing with a tangled mix of colourful roses and a mishmash of pretty perennials that had been brutally suffering in this heat, with leaves wilting and sorrowful sad flowers hanging their heads in shame. Furthermore, many of her beloved rose leaves had been viciously attacked by beetles, despite having been fastidiously sprayed with a rose care product to keep such nasty hustlers away. Looking after roses was for Lilac a full-time job, but she loved her roses. She was willing to put up with all the effort she could muster to give them the best possible care. Lilac's 1950s white cottage, with its climbing roses tumbling around the front door, gave her home a charming, poetic look. It was the kind of cottage romance authors wrote about in their dreamy, wistful novels. Lilac was about as house-proud as you could possibly get, and she was certainly hoping her new next-door neighbour, who had moved in next door, would follow a similar tune to hers. There was nothing worse, in Lilac's opinion, than living next to a neighbour who allowed their yard to go to seed. Lilac had seen no sign of anyone tending to the yard in the next-door neighbour's property, and her heart sank to her boots at the thought of her beautiful yard overlooking a tangle of weeds from next door. The mysterious young woman who'd moved into the cottage next door a few weeks back appeared to be one of those crazed sun-worshippers, the type of passionate sunbather you'd have found in the 70s or early 80s, who had no idea just how lethal the consequences of the sun actually were. This clueless young lady seemed like the only other mad person, other than Lilac herself, of course, that was exposing herself to the sun
on this lonely afternoon. The only difference being, of course, that Lilac was fully covered, whereas this woman was not. Lilac noticed that the next-door neighbour was forever wearing a skimpy bright red bikini that left little to the imagination, and she spent most of the long, sizzling hot afternoons lying indulgently stretched out on a sun lounger, slathering herself with baby oil, as if her life depended on it. Lilac had half a mind to go over to the woman and blazonly ask her what she was doing, soaking up the sun like a half-crazed salamander, but she couldn't do that, for that would be presumptuous, for she hardly knew the young lady. Lilac wondered if her new next-door neighbour had ever heard of skin cancer before, or was she living in a delusional, altered reality, where such things did not exist in her world. Lilac had lost a good friend a while back to stage 4 malignant melanoma, so she didn't take kindly to people frying their bodies unscrupulously in direct sunlight, knowing only too well the intrinsic dangers it presented. That woman, whoever she was, appeared to be cordially inviting disaster to her front door, with wide open arms, as if asking skin cancer to become her new best friend. Lilac was in no doubt that if her neighbour carried on subjecting her body to such reckless, ill-considered abuse, it would invariably catch up with her in the foreseeable future, when she got a little older, perhaps. Skin cancer was a cruel, clandestine killer. It furtively crept up on you unawares, so toying with the sun was not something any wise soul would take on lightly. "By the time that young lady gets to my age," Lilac thought privately to herself, "if cancer doesn't get her first, she'll end up looking like a wrinkled, shriveled-up old prune. But then again, youngsters never think about such things these days." It was like it never occurred to them that their youth was fleeting and would one day be gone, like the wisps of smoke from a chimney. It seemed like only the other day Lilac herself was only 21, and yet time had gone by so fast, in a flash. She wondered where it had got to. Sometimes when she saw the crepey lines that had developed around her pretty cornflower blue eyes, and the slackening skin on her neck, she'd wonder if the woman staring back at her in the mirror was actually her. Lilac had taken good care of her peachy complexion over the years, and even in her youth she had been one of the wise ones that had stayed well out of the sun, but that was because her skin had always been fair, and predisposed to burning quite badly. This meant her skin was not damaged, so it was looking good for her age, but even so, she had seen what the hands of time had done to her body, and it wasn't pretty, as these days everything appeared to be hanging south. Lilac wasn't sure how old her new next-door neighbour actually was. At a guess she'd put her between her late 20s and early 30s, but more to the point, what was she doing here in their small rural town, living on her own without any signs of a husband or kids, or any friends to actually speak of? It was awfully strange, Lilac could not help but think, for a pretty young lady like this, to be living such an isolated, hermetic existence. It was almost sad. It was as if the young lady was keeping herself strictly to herself. She was deliberately distancing herself from everybody in the local community, being very aloof towards strangers, including Lilac herself, which Lilac found rather peculiar, as everybody living in this neck of the woods knew each other reasonably well. But this young lady seemed to have intentionally cocooned herself away from the rest of the world, as if she delighted in being on her own. The next-door neighbour's cottage, Wispy Wind, had once belonged to old Mrs. Anna Perkins, whom had dropped down dead on her front porch one day, after she was shooing a rat off the premises that had managed to get into her kitchen pantry and scavenge around in a box of cereal, leaving a trail of droppings behind, along with sprays of urine all over the side of the cupboard. At the time, Lilac had been planting some garden herbs rather assiduously in the yard, when Mrs. Perkins had run out of her house with a broom splayed up in the air that she was waving around madly, in unbridled defensive gestures. She appeared to be chasing something or someone, and screaming loudly at the top of her lungs. Lilac had thought the woman was shooing away a stranger that had broken into her house, one of those low-live youngsters, looking to take advantage of the vulnerability of an old lady, by stealing some of her valuables to support a drug habit of some kind. You heard about such things often enough. Lilac arrived on the scene with a baseball bat in her hand, never once considering her own safety. She felt so angry and aggrieved that someone had the blatant audacity to break into the old woman's cottage in the middle of the day of all things, and was clandestinely admiring Mrs. Perkins for having the balls to chase the intruder away with her broom. A lesser woman might have crumbled in such a situation. "Are you all right, Anna?" Lilac had asked, rushing over to the terrified woman to offer her comfort. Lilac was looking around the premises for any signs of the intruder, but the street remained resolutely quiet, as if nothing untoward had actually happened. Mrs. Perkins was as white as a sheet. She clutched her chest tightly and pointed towards a collection of bushes. "He's hiding in there," she whispered, looking at Lilac with round, haunted eyes. "I saw him go in there." She clutched Lilac's arm. "Make him go away, Lilac. Please, I'm begging you, make him go away. If he comes near me, I'll die. I'm telling you, I'll die." "You're going to be just fine, Mrs. Perkins, I'm sure of that. I'm here now. But are you telling me the intruder is still on your property? How's that possible? You chased him away with a broomstick, did you not?" Mrs. Perkins nodded. "He's still there. He's hiding in those bushes. He's probably watching us right now. Oh, the thought of it. His eyes all over the place. Those dark eyes. Oh, my goodness. What if he comes back inside? What if he comes into my house again? I don't think my heart will be able to handle it." "Don't you worry about any of this, Mrs. Perkins. I will sort out the intruder for you. Believe me, by the time I'm finished with the man, he'll never come back to your house again, and that's a promise," she had said resolutely, with anger bubbling up inside her chest as she marched over to the bushes, expecting to see a young lad cowering behind the foliage, looking up at her with frightened eyes, and probably begging her not to call the police. "Now you need to leave at once," Lilac had said boldly. "Come out of the bushes right now. What do you mean, scaring an old woman half to death like this?" But when she reached the bush, she felt foolish. Nothing and nobody was there. "Whoever he is, Mrs. Perkins, he's long gone," Lilac told the woman, feeling a sense of profound relief that she didn't have to face the intruder herself, who might be wielding a knife or even a revolver. You could never be too sure these days. At least the threat had long passed, and the intruder would never ever be foolish enough to come back, as he would have realized that Anna Perkins, although an elderly woman, was not such an easy target after all. "It's going to be all right, Mrs. Perkins. You can file a report with the police. I'm very sure the intruder has long gone. You scared him off, chasing him out of your cottage with that broomstick of yours. You should be proud of yourself, Mrs. Perkins. You've got balls, let me tell you. I really admire you for that. You probably didn't see him get away, but you mark my words, intruders don't tend to hang around for very long." Anna Perkins was still trembling. "But he hasn't gone! He's still there! Oh, my God, he's there!" she said, letting out a formidable scream. And that was when Lilac had seen a rat scurrying away from the bushes. Granted, it was a big rat, one of the biggest she'd ever seen. But was her neighbour, Mrs. Perkins, seriously going into a major panic attack over a simple rat? Had the woman not lived in the country for long enough not to be afraid of such things? "He's over there! Can you see him? He's running away!" "Calm down," Lilac had told Mrs. Perkins, who, after seeing the rat again, her breathing had quickened. She clutched her chest tightly. She took some frantic gasps of air, as if she couldn't get enough oxygen into her lungs. And then Mrs. Perkins collapsed on the ground in a crumpled, defeated heap. "It's all right, Mrs. Perkins. The rat has gone," said Lilac reassuringly, trying to help the old woman back onto her feet. But Mrs. Perkins' body was limp like that of a rag doll, and when Lilac tried to wake her up, she discovered that the woman was dead. Lilac was sure that the shock of seeing a rat had inadvertently killed the woman. This was of course later confirmed by her son Tucker, whom had told Lilac that his mother had a dreadful, crippling, paralysing fear of rats. "She used to pass out when I was a little boy, just looking at a rat," he told Anna. "I don't suspect at her age her heart could take seeing one close up. The fear must have done her in." People in town were naturally very sad about Mrs. Perkins' fortuitous passing. But to be fair, she was 95 years old, going on 96. There were worse ways to meet your end, Lilac had reasoned, although Anna Perkins is unlikely to have agreed. A week later, Tucker Perkins had got the ball rolling and put Wispy Wind Cottage, which his mother had transferred into his name, long before her passing, onto the market. And within half an hour of being put up for sale, the property had been purchased by an unknown, very eager cash buyer, who had bought the cottage on a whim, after only viewing it online, without even physically seeing it. And that had been that. And after Tucker had cleared the house out, after his late mother's death, a week later the mysterious young woman, with the long dark hair and refined-looking features, had moved into the next-door house. The town was abuzz with curious inquiring questions about the young lady living at Wispy Wind Cottage. Where was she from? What was she doing in their small, unassuming town? People's interest in the woman increased exponentially, like an ever-expanding waistline that would not stop growing. Lilac surmised that if the woman was a wee bit friendlier towards the locals, and more forthcoming about herself, then tongues in town would not be wagging so very much. When the young lady had moved in next door, Lilac had taken it upon herself to do the neighbourly thing. She had made one of her delicious apple pies and knocked on her neighbour's door. She was thinking of even asking the young lady to join her for dinner one evening, as after all it was the courteous thing to do, as people in these parts were naturally friendly, and it was good to be on first-name terms with your next-door neighbour. Lilac gingerly approached her next-door neighbour's front door. She could hear a radio blasting away from somewhere inside the cottage. It was some hell and damnation Bible passage about the horrors of hell. She could hear a man's booming voice blasting abruptly through the walls of the cottage like a jackhammer drill. The thunderously foreboding voice almost shook the entire cottage with the formidable vibration of his raspy cadence. "The unrighteous will weep. They will gnash their teeth in reaction to the pain and the suffering inflicted in that fire. If you don't want to go to that desolate, forsaken place, you need to abandon your sins to seek the grace of the good Lord Jesus Christ. Do you want to burn in the raging fire of hell? Do you?" "No," came the voices of the congregation. The preacher clapped his hands. "Well, then you need to humble yourselves before Almighty God to seek his forgiveness. For no one in this church is worthy of God's grace. Do you understand? No one is worthy of God's grace. No one. We will all be filthy, loathsome sinners. That's what we are, that deserve only condemnation and judgment. But our God is good. He will show mercy to the repentant heart. But the fool will turn his face away from our good Lord. The fires of hell will gladly receive him. And when he meets his end, Satan will drag him kicking and screaming to the fiery inferno. For there will be no rest for the wicked, no moment of reprieve, no opportunity to repent, for by then it will be too late, for their fate will be firmly sealed, and they will burn eternally in that fire. They will beg for death, but death will not receive them. They will cry out for forgiveness, but the Lord will be mute to their prayers." This was followed by loud choruses of cheers. "Praise God!" cried the congregation. "Praise God! May he have mercy on our souls!" "And he will have mercy, for your hearts are repentant. Remember the man next to Jesus on the cross, the sinner. Jesus said to him, 'Today you will be in paradise with me.' Do you hear that?" "Yes!" the congregation cried. "Yes!" Lilac knocked on the door, feeling a tad intimidated by the preacher's sermon. She couldn't help but feel it seemed incongruous for a woman wearing an immodest, itsy-bitsy red bikini most of the day, flaunting her close to naked body in the sun so shamelessly, to be listening to stuff like this, for her immodest attire did not go hand in hand with strong religious affiliations. I mean, usually when people were that religious, they dressed modestly, did they not? You saw it in the Muslim religion all the time, and the religious zealots, all dressing in clothes that covered their dignity. Lilac had knocked several times on the door. She heard a shuffle. She looked up towards the second-floor window and was sure she'd seen the curtains twitching. Was her neighbour watching her clandestinely, peering through a crack in the curtains from the upstairs window, she wondered. She knocked again, and failed to get an answer. Even though Lilac knew the young woman was definitely there, she was sure of it. The woman barely even left her cottage. The woman's red Jeep Wrangler was a bit of a giveaway as well. It was stoically parked in the driveway, under the large green canvas awning of the carport, a stone's throw away from the front door. Lilac chose to leave the apple pie on the Adirondack table on the front porch, next to a bottle of baby oil and a folded-up fluffy beach towel that smelt strongly of coconut tanning oil. Luckily she had a notepad in her purse that she happened to have on her person, which was a stroke of luck. She scribbled a note which she placed on top of the pie. "Just to welcome you to your new home. I'm your next-door neighbour, Lilac Evans. Feel free to pop around for a coffee any time you like. I'm always around. It would be great to meet you." Lilac had scuttled away, briefly glancing up again at the upstairs window, where she'd previously seen some movement. Sure enough, she was almost certain she'd seen the ambiguous shadowy image of a face staring down at her, and seen the curtains twitch again, and finally close, as if the shadowy figure had retreated. Lilac knew that her neighbour was definitely hiding there in the house, and deliberately not answering the door to her. But why would she do such an idiosyncratic thing, she wondered. Maybe she was caught off guard. Perhaps she just had a shower, Lilac told herself. Or perhaps she was feeling poorly, and was not well enough to go to the door. I mean, maybe she had a pounding headache after laying out in the sun all day. That wouldn't surprise Lilac at all. Lilac waited patiently for several days for some kind of response from her next-door neighbour, but none came, even though the woman religiously continued with her tanning rituals on her front deck, and on seeing Lilac bustling around in her yard, attending to her plants, had thrown her a couple of nods. Only days later, Lilac had heard a cluttering sound at the built-in letterbox in her front door. Buddy had barked excitedly, and she had followed her eager golden retriever to the door. She had found a folded-up note that had been pushed through the letterbox, lying on the floor. She opened the note rather curiously. It contained only 4 scribbled words. "Thanks for the pie." The note wasn't even signed. Lilac stared incredulously at the note, not knowing what to make of it. She mumbled something under her breath and said, "Strange, very strange." Buddy, who was looking up at her through his soulful dark eyes, began to woof, as if in agreement. "That was our neighbour, Buddy, our next-door neighbour," she told her dog, stroking his soft golden hair tenderly between her fingers. "I don't know how to make her out, Buddy. She's a funny thing, she is. I don't think I've ever met anyone in my life quite so aloof." Buddy woofed, as if he perfectly agreed with everything his owner said. Wispy Wind Cottage was much like Lilac's place, a pretty prepossessing whitewashed cottage. Indeed, the entire neighbourhood boasted a collection of rather eclectic cottages built circa 1950. But most of these charming abodes were as individualistic and unique as the people that owned them, with names like Wildflower Way, Daisy Dell, Evergreen Escape, Ivy Hollow, and Red Rose Cottage. No surprises for guessing that with Lilac love of roses, her cottage was called the Dreaming Rose. It was a friendly neighbourhood, some might have called a village, which was only a short distance from a town, where it was common to traditionally go to a butcher for your meat, your baker for your bread, your greengrocer for your vegetables, and the good old diner for a slap-up hearty meal, of which the portions were exceptionally generous. It would seem the people living here liked supporting the local economy, which was a good thing, as it made the town thrive. It boasted a hairdresser's belonging to the Esther twins, who were identical, you couldn't even tell them apart, which Lilac found a tad annoying, as the two women, who were well in their 30s, would giggle madly like a couple of giddy teenagers when you couldn't identify who was who. You'd think by now that old long-standing joke would have worn thin, but obviously not. The Esther twins adored being mistaken for each other. They were Marilyn Monroe look-alikes, and took great pains to wear the same black eyeliner, red lipstick, and hairstyle that Marilyn Monroe would have sported. They would even dress like their favourite icon, and make the same identical outfits, as if they shunned individuality of any kind, and liked to look exactly the same. "You've got that wrong," they would say to Lilac. "No, I'm Rona. She's Tasha. You can always tell us apart, you know. It's not that difficult. Tasha's got a tiny little mole above the left lip. I have nothing." Lilac was bemused by this revelation, for as far as she was concerned, there was no discernible mole above Tasha's lip that she could see. So she was always mixing the twins' identities up, much to their great amusement. Lilac went to the hairdresser's every Friday morning like clockwork, to have her bottle strawberry blonde hair, which had once been her natural colour, blow-dried and styled. But she liked her regular little rendezvous with the Esther sisters, because as a hairdresser's they were gossip central of the small town, and that was the quintessential reason she religiously kept up her appointments. She liked to keep abreast of things going on locally, and where better to hear about them than the hairdressers, of course. Let's just say if you wanted to get the latest scoop on what was going on, making a hair appointment with the Esther sisters would reward you big time, for there was nothing those two young ladies didn't know about what was going on in the local community. But when Lilac's mysterious young new neighbour had moved into the cottage next door to her, no one knew much about her, not even the Esther sisters, which was an all-time first. "So tell us, Lilac, about the young lady that's moved in to old Mrs. Perkins' cottage next door to yours," Rona asked her, as she skilfully with her adroit fingers swept the curling tongs through Lilac's full-bodied hair. "Come on, spill! You must know something. I've seen her around. Pretty little thing, dark hair. But I don't think that black hair of hers is natural. It's definitely dyed. I can tell these things, you know." Lilac tried to think. "Well, I know that she roasts her body in the sun for several hours a day. And if that's not bad enough, she slathers herself with ubiquitous amounts of baby oil and something that smells strongly of coconut. She lies out there on her deck all day in a skimpy red bikini. Unfortunately, her front deck overlooks my property, so I see everything. Nothing is left to the imagination. Sometimes I think she's even been topless, but I try not to look, you know. It's embarrassing, isn't it? It's not that I'm snooping, of course. It's just hard not to see what your neighbour is getting up to. Our cottages are terribly close, you see. I know, for example, every morning she goes for a jog, at the very same time, very early it is. She takes the footpath at the bottom of the cul-de-sac, where everybody takes their dogs for walks in the woods. I've seen her round town, you know, going shopping for stuff, but she's practically at home all the time. She reads a great deal, you know, on that sun lounger of hers, magazines and books. I mean, she's a young lady, late 20s, early 30s. I'm not sure of her age. She's got no husband or boyfriend to speak of, and no family as far as I can tell. No one, as far as I have seen, has ever visited her since she's moved into that property. She's very much a loner as far as I can see, shutting the whole world out of her life. I can't help thinking she must get awfully lonely, stuck in that cottage all day long. Yet she seems terribly reluctant to make friends, or to go out on a limb to be particularly friendly. She's rather like a closed book that is stuck together with superglue, if you ask me. Rona pulled a face. It's all right for some, isn't it? She said, shaking her head sorrowfully. Some of us actually have a living to make. We can't while away the long, lonely hours doing absolutely nothing. That woman must be loaded, just being able to stay at home all day at her age. Who does that at such a young age? Why are some of us just born with a silver spoon in our mouths? Me and Tash, we were sweeping the floor of this salon that once belonged to my mother at 9 years old. Can you believe that? 9 years old. We were washing people's hair, and by the time I was 13, I was actually giving people haircuts. And this young lady lies back on her deck all day, sunning herself. It makes me sick. I've got nothing against her, of course. I don't know her from Adam. But I do resent it when I hear stuff like that. You say she was sunbathing, interjected Trish, who was trimming someone's hair, and looked up towards Lilac with a furrowed brow. That's not good, is it? Look at the weather of late. It's a scorcher out there. It's not healthy to be sitting out in the sun. Of course that's not healthy, Rona agreed. I mean, who does that nowadays? Sunbathe, I mean. That went out of fashion by the end of the 80s. Big time. Nobody does that today. Unless, of course, you're covered to the nines in lots and lots of blockout. Mind you, a friend of mine was on a beach in Brazil recently. She told me people were baking in the sun like hot potatoes. And I'm not joking either. Some of them had tans that were really dark. They looked so leathery and were wearing the skimpiest swimming costumes that you've ever seen. Maybe some people don't care about the long-term ramifications of overdoing it in the sun. What's wrong with your next-door neighbour, Lilac, smothering herself with baby oil like that? That's asking for trouble. Doesn't she know anything about the dangers of skin cancer, or is she obliviously naive of what she's actually doing to herself? When me and Tasha, we go for our yearly checkups with that dermatologist, the place is jam-packed with people. Everybody freaks out about their skin and moles and anything on their skin. They're so terrified of getting skin cancer. Well, I don't think she's aware of what she's doing, admitted Lilac. She's clueless, as some of these sun worshippers in Brazil obviously are. Or maybe she just doesn't care. You know how some people are. They falsely believe they won't be the ones that get skin cancer. It'll happen to somebody else, but never to them. I always think when you think like that, you're almost tempting fate. I've learned to say never. Maybe you should warn her, said Rona, shaking her blonde curls defiantly. I mean, really, cancer is a big deal these days. You could save a life when you point these things out. No one in their right mind would risk getting a golden tan for the sake of cancer. It's not worth it. So what's this young lady's name, by the way? Everyone's been asking us that question. Your guess is as good as mine. I haven't got a clue. Rona looked floored. She raised a perfectly arched brow. Let's get this straight. Are you telling me, Lilac, you haven't even spoken to your next-door neighbour yet? And she's moved into the cottage right next to you. Around here, everybody knows their neighbours. I would have thought you, of all people, Lilac, would have gone over to Wispy Wind Cottage to introduce yourself to the woman. You're not exactly what I would describe as shrinking violet, Lilac. I can assure you, Rona, it has not been for want of trying. If you must know, I did go over to her cottage. I left a homemade apple pie for her on the Adirondack table on her front deck. I knocked on her door. I knew she was in. I noticed a curtain twitching in the upstairs window. I was sure I saw her face at the window, but she did not answer the door to me. Finally, I left the apple pie there with a note on the top saying she was welcome to pop around any time she liked. and that my name was Lilac Evans and that I would love to meet her. I mean, what else could I do? I was trying to be friendly." "And?" asked Rona, raising a brow. "Well, I hope she thanked you for the apple pie." "Well, I didn't hear from her for a few days. I mean, I saw her sunning herself on her front deck, of course, and to be fair, she nodded at me from a distance, gave me a half-hearted wave, you could say. But then I got a note in my letterbox with just 4 words on it, saying, 'Thanks for the pie.' That was about all." "How rude is that?" said Rona, inserting some more hair into a hot iron. She was holding and smoothing out a sleek strawberry blonde curl. "I mean, the least she could do was pop around and introduce herself to you. Thank you for making a pie for her. It's the cordial thing to do. Some people have no manners, do they?" "Maybe she's shy," said Tasha, brushing away some cut hair from the back of her client's collar. "Remember what Dawn Saroy used to be like? Oh, my word, that woman was so timid, as quiet as a church mouse she was. Would never say boo to a goose. She'd sit here in one of these chairs for years on end. We never got a peep out of her, did we, Rona?" "No, we didn't." "Believe me," continued Tasha, "it wasn't for want of trying. We'd ask her questions, and she'd give us ambiguous, vague, one-word answers. Sometimes we didn't know what she was saying. She would speak in muted tones. It was really annoying. One day she started to talk, and when she did, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Didn't I, Rona? I got the shock of my life." She was shocked, that's for sure. "Well, it was like poking a dead jellyfish that suddenly comes back to life. I was the one who used to work on her hair, you see. So I really was startled when she started talking. She admitted to me that she'd been crippled by an excruciating bout of painful shyness and social awkwardness for years. She told us people always misunderstood her evasiveness for being rude. She admitted to hiding from people any chance she got. She was terribly uncomfortable in all kinds of social interactions. At the time, she was seeing a therapist who dared her to try and make conversation with me in our salon, to step out of her comfort zone, so to speak, to overcome her fear of being social. These days you can't shut Dawn up. She's one of our biggest talkers in town, so the therapy actually worked." "Yes, I know Dawn Saroy very well indeed, but I had absolutely no idea she used to be a shrinking violet. You'd have never have guessed that for a moment. But if you must know, I really don't think my next-door neighbour is bashfully shy like Dawn used to be. I'd say she's aloof, but not shy. Definitely not shy. I mean, would you hang around on your front deck in a bright red skimpy bikini for any bystanders to see you if you were shy? I don't think that's bashful behaviour, do you? I mean, she knows I can see her very well from my yard." "Well, we've established she's not shy," agreed Rona. "Shy people shrink away in a corner. They don't do anything to draw attention to themselves, do they? And I agree with Lilac. A skimpy red bikini gets your attention. Is there any other reason you think she's not shy? Or is that just it?" "Well, the stuff she listens to on the radio. It's pretty out there. I can't imagine a demure person listening to stuff like that. But of course I do stand to be corrected." "How do you know what she listens to on the radio, Lilac?" asked Rona incredulously. "You're not spying on your next-door neighbour, are you?" she teased. She waved a mischievous finger at Lilac. "Who's been a naughty, naughty girl? Maybe you know what she's watched on television last night, what she ate for dinner yesterday. Go on, tell us. Your secret's safe with us, Lilac." "Oh, don't be ridiculous. Listen to the two of you going on like this," said Lilac, brushing as red as a field of poppies. "Honestly, Rona, you do know how to stir the pot. I am no snoop, but if you call noticing things snooping, well, then I plead guilty. I told you I know nothing about my new next-door neighbour. I've been telling you that since I came to the salon this morning. Let's just say when I was dropping over that apple pie, I heard what she was listening to on the radio when I knocked on the front door. It was not hard to hear that radio show, even if I'd been blocking my ears. Put it this way, the preacher's voice was booming so loudly, it made the glasses, well, it would have made the glasses on any table rattle rather precariously. And I'm not exaggerating about that either. That was quite some sermon that he was preaching, let me tell you. All about the dangers of hell and how we all deserve to go there. And that's where we will end up burning in the fire without a repentant heart. That kind of thing. Wow, said Rona. She was listening to depressing stuff like that. That is so bleak. It's not exactly cheery, is it? It would seem so. The radio was turned up on full volume. Goodness gracious! Your next-door neighbour is turning out to be quite interesting. I'm getting more curious about her the more we speak about her. Let's see, she roasts on her patio all day like a hot potato, wearing an itsy-bitsy red bikini, without any polka dots, I might add, slathers herself with baby oil like there's no tomorrow, lies indulgently on a sun lounger all day reading a book, doesn't appear to have any job, and listens to unconventional radio programmes that would make us hurry off to the First Catholic Confession Chamber, or whatever you call those things, to confess our sins, lest we ourselves should be thrown into the fiery pit of hell. Furthermore, the young lady doesn't answer the door to you, Lilac, when you knock on it. She leaves you no more than a note, with a vague thank you for your apple pie, which means you still don't even know her name. There's something not right about all this. She's clearly hiding something, don't you think? I don't agree, said Tasha, shaking her head vigorously. I still say she's painfully shy. That's my humble opinion. Just because you're shy doesn't mean you wouldn't wear a skimpy red bikini. I mean, she was privately sunning herself on her front deck, wasn't she? I mean, what's wrong with that? Lots of people do that, whether they're shy or not. It's normal behaviour. Lilac saw her sunbathing on her front deck, but nobody else did. People are entitled to do what they want to do in private. Maybe she's religious. That's why she listens to that radio stuff and has extreme views about things. Nothing wrong with that, if you ask me. It's a free world. We should be encouraged to find our own truth. If listening to a hell and damnation preacher floats her boat, I say, why not? It's so typical of you to be so practical, Tash. But you do make some good points there, Rona agreed. Maybe we're being far too judgmental. I have to say, Lilac, when you came here for your appointment at the salon this morning, we were both so excited about seeing you. Not that we aren't always excited, but I thought you'd be able to tell us much more about your next-door neighbour. I'm so disappointed you have so little to tell us about her. Everything you've told us about her makes us more and more intrigued. Well, I wish I knew more about the mystery young lady, Lilac admitted. But you know the saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. If you must know, I thought the other way round, actually. I thought when I came here to the hair salon this morning that you two would be able to tell me all about my next-door neighbour, not the other way round. Hold on a moment, Lilac. Where would you get that absurd idea from? We're a hairdressing salon, not a private investigator's office, I'd like to remind you. And let's not forget, you're the one living next door to this new woman who's moved to town. So you should know a lot more about her than we do. Well, I wouldn't entirely agree with you, Rona. People talk in a small town, don't they? Word gets around like wildfire. And it always starts here in your hair salon, which is why the two of you tend to know everything that's going on in town. That has been my experience to date. Well, that's true to a certain extent, Lilac. But to be fair, everybody's talking about your new next-door neighbour. She's been seen around town, buying stuff, But when people say anything to her in passing, try to greet her with a warm, friendly smile, she's just very abrupt. Always seems to be in a tearing hurry to get away. It's like squeezing an empty tomato ketchup container. You can't get anything out of the woman. A day later, when Lilac had decided to buy some stewing meat to make a casserole for dinner, she found herself standing rather aimlessly in a long queue at the butcher's. Lilac couldn't believe her luck when she found herself standing behind her elusive next-door neighbour, whose long, sleek, dark, shiny hair smelt of apple shampoo. Lilac was certain she'd also caught a whiff of the familiar coconut oil that she used on her person. This might be the perfect opportunity to get better acquainted with her new next-door neighbour by starting up a friendly conversation. At first the young lady did not appear to see Lilac, so Lilac tapped her gently on the shoulder to get her immediate attention. The young lady turned around so abruptly. She looked at Lilac with wide eyes. At first she appeared like a deer caught in headlights, rather startled. But when she realized it was Lilac that had tapped her, an expression of relief washed over her pretty face. "Oh, I'm so sorry to give you a start, love," said Lilac apologetically. "I thought I recognized you. I don't know if you remember me, but I'm your next-door neighbour, Lilac Evans. It's good to finally meet you close up. We've only nodded at each other from a distance, haven't we? We've been a bit like two passing ships in the night. Fancy meeting you here in the butcher of all things. Mind you, Mr. Medcoff has the best beef in these parts, you know. I'm told he only sources grass-fed beef. You could never get this kind of quality meat in a supermarket. I must recommend the homemade sausages he makes. Mr. Medcoff has won awards for those sausages, you know. My favourite is the pork, apple and sage sausages. You've got to give them a try. They're incredibly good. That's if you like pork, of course." The woman's face remained expressionless as she just stared at Lilac, as if looking through a clear pane of glass. Finally she nodded. "I like pork. I'll bear that in mind for next time. So you live next door to me. You're Lilac, then?" "That's right, I'm Lilac, and it is so good to finally make your acquaintance, dear. I have been meaning to introduce myself. I did come around to your house with an apple pie for you. I knocked on the door, but you must have been out. Your radio was on at the time." The woman nodded and gave Lilac a watery smile. She really wasn't much of a talker, was she? Getting her to say more than a couple of words was rather like extracting blood out of a stone. But Lilac was not willing to give up on the young lady. Not yet. Lilac continued to be intrigued by her next-door neighbour, wondering what this young lady was actually hiding. She was definitely hiding something. It was not natural to be so equivocatingly standoffish and non-committal, unless, of course, Trish Esther was absolutely right, and the young lady was painfully shy. But Lilac did not think that this was the case. Her instincts told her otherwise. Lilac shrugged her shoulders to make polite conversation. It really was a tad embarrassing, being neighbours with this young lady, and not speaking to her beyond a nod in passing. She really wanted to change the dynamics of their relationship. But this stranger was not making it remotely easy for her, so it would seem her fruitless efforts were met with little success, as she struggled to find something fitting to say. She cleared her throat. "Tell me, dear, how are you finding the neighbourhood here?" There was a stiff, rather uncomfortable pause, as if the woman was reluctant to answer her question. "Oh, it's charming, isn't it?" Lilac was unimpressed by the young lady's prevaricating nondescript words. What did charming actually mean? It was so cliché. It could mean anything. It was like stating the blindingly obvious. The small town was absolutely charming, but it was also so much more than that. Lilac bit her lip awkwardly. She wanted to find out so much more about this enigmatic young lady. She would keep officiously prodding, even if it killed her. She didn't like to have an awkward, strained relationship with her next-door neighbour. It would be good to finally become friends. "I imagine this neighbourhood must be very different from where you've come from, my dear." She gave the woman an encouraging smile. Yes, very. As the queue shuffled forward, Lilac asked again, And where was that? I hope you don't mind my asking. New York, said the woman. Lilac inwardly grimaced. Talk about being blatantly vague and indeterminate. This was New York State, for goodness sake. It was such a huge, widespread place. The woman's off-the-cuff remarks would cover a massive grey shadowy area of possibility. You mean you lived in the city? Queens, perhaps? Brooklands, maybe? She asked inquiringly, hoping the woman would be much more pacific. Yes, something like that. Lilac had a disingenuous, rather wooden smile on her face that was so large it was actually making her cheeks hurt. She wanted to appear friendly, to encourage her neighbour to talk, but by the looks of things she was not getting very far. Lilac would be a useless interrogator, she decided to herself. She still knew absolutely nothing about her neighbour. I hope you don't mind my asking, and you don't think I'm a little bit impertinent, but, I notice you don't appear to work. Only you're at home a lot of the time on your deck reading a book. Are you taking a leave of absence from your job, perhaps? Having a bit of a much-needed break? I'm retired, said the young lady. Lilac was taken aback, thrown off her pedestal. She looked completely bewildered. You are retired? But you're so young. I mean, you can't be a day over 30. I'm in my 50s, you know, and I still work from home. Still need to bring the coppers rolling in, she chuckled. I guess I'm just lucky, said the woman. I don't need to work. Well, you are very lucky then. Sorry, do forgive me, said Lilac, but I don't even know your name. It's Petty Wainscoat, said the woman. For a moment Lilac felt triumphant, as if the slot machine she had injected some cash in had finally responded in kind with a reward, even if it was rather meagre. She had a name for the mysterious stranger. That was a promising start, even if it was a little one. Well, it's a lovely name, dear. I haven't heard it before. The name Petty, I mean. It's unusual, but very pretty. It's kind of you to say. It's not foreign by any chance. The name Petty, I mean. No, it's American. I'm American, said the woman, looking put out. Petty Waincoat seemed relieved to have reached the front of the queue, where she could hastily abandon her conversation with Lilac and fully absorb herself in buying meat from the local butcher. What will it be, madam? Came Mr. Medcoff's friendly, upbeat voice. I'll have some of those pork chops, please. Good choice, madam. Very tender. How many? Said the butcher, placing chops in a plastic bag. 6 will do me fine, thank you very much. The butcher handed her the pork chops. There you go, madam. Have a very good day, and enjoy the chops. Petty Wainscoat turned around for a brief second to nod at Lilac politely. Good to meet you, Lilac. I must go now. Before the woman could walk away, Lilac immediately said, I'm so sorry, dear. I hope you don't think I'm meddling in your own business, but I notice you spending a lot of time sunbathing on your wooden deck. It's just the weather out there recently has been such a scorcher. I'm sure you agree. You can tell me, of course, to mind my own business, but I worry about people like you baking in the sun for so long, with all that skin cancer going around. Just take care of yourself, dear. That's all I'm saying. I'm just watching out for you. You've got such a lovely complexion, but the sun can do no end of damage to the skin, you know. Petty seemed to glare at Lilac for a brief moment with a how dare you kind of look written all over her face. Then she promptly sashayed out of the butchery with an annoyed swagger in her gait, swinging the small plastic bag in her hand that contained the chops, as if the last thing she needed was to be judged by a snoopy but well-meaning next-door neighbour. Lilac couldn't blame her for being affronted. Her unguarded words had seamlessly just slipped out of her mouth like melted butter that slides down a corn cob, before she could actually stop them. She was sure she had offended Petty Wainscroft, and that was the last thing she intended doing. She was looking out for her, that's all, but it had come out all desperately wrong. Lilac began silently cursing herself. "What did you say that for, you silly old mare? Petty is going to think you're a good-for-nothing nosy busybody. And, of course, she's probably exactly right about you." The following morning, when Lilac was out in her yard, attending to her beloved rose bushes, under the shade of her huge navy blue straw hat, with Buddy parked again in his usual shaded position under the sycamore tree, where he was contentedly drifting off into a deep, very comfortable sleep, which was becoming increasingly more common these days, as Lilac's dog was getting along in years, and was not as alert and as sharp as he used to be. Buddy remained blissfully fast asleep when Lilac noticed a silver Mercedes rolling up her next-door neighbour's driveway. Now this was curiously interesting. Someone was actually paying Petty a visit, which was a first time, and Lilac was determined to get a bird's-eye view of this curious stranger. It might tell her a lot more about her next-door neighbour. Lilac didn't consider herself to be a snoop, but she couldn't help the insatiable curiosity that held her to ransom on this morning, as she had grown increasingly more and more intrigued by Petty Waincloth, and her strange antics over the last few weeks that had certainly inspired her curiosity. She steadily manoeuvred herself into a position behind some high-growing shrubs that bordered both properties like a half-hearted dividing hedge. She knew that if she clandestinely peered through the branches, that she'd be able to get a close-up view of the stranger. She watched the man climb out of his silver Mercedes, slamming the door behind him so loudly that Lilac almost jumped out of her skin. She noticed the young man appeared rather edgy and nervous. He looked up and down the street, to the left and right, almost as if he was very troubled that someone might potentially be following him. For a brief second he almost looked directly in Lilac's direction, as if he was seeing her peering at him through the foliage. She wondered if he sensed he was being watched by her. Who was he, she wondered? A boyfriend of Petty's, perhaps? He was reasonably good-looking, she thought, tall and slender, with well-developed shoulders and a long angular face, a very neat, perfectly straight nose, with windswept brown hair and an olive complexion. His features were quite chiselled, she thought, giving him an almost aristocratic look. She noted he was wearing casual white chinos and a navy blue cotton shirt, where the sleeves were rolled up, along with a pair of tanned loafers. The 6-foot man strolled up rather casually to the front door, but his casual stroll did have an apprehensive edge, almost as if he didn't believe he would be greeted with a rapturous welcome from Petty Waincroft. Lilac wondered if he was a spurned lover, looking to make amends with Petty, and afraid of being spat out by the young lady. She watched the gentleman knocking on the door rather timidly, and surprise, surprise, there was no answer. The young man increased his light tap to a loud rap. To the point of rudeness, he began knocking in earnest on the door. He was resolutely determined to get that door answered, and was staring up at the upper floor of the cottage towards the window. Finally he called out, "I know you are there, pet. Please don't be like this. Come down, will you? I saw you twitching that curtain. I can hear the radio on. I know you're in. Don't play these games with me." The young man, in exasperation, rubbed a hand impatiently through his hair, and after some time the door was abruptly pushed open. Even though Lilac was watching the scene from a small distance away, she noticed that Petty's body language was not best pleased to see this stranger. She stood there awkwardly, wearing black leggings and a loose-fitting pink T-shirt. There was a disagreeable, disgruntled and rather peeved expression written all over her face. Lilac was surprised that she could hear the rather disjointed conversation between the two of them. This was a plus. She might learn something more about her ambiguous neighbour, she hoped. "What are you doing here, Ryan? I thought I told you not to come here. Why the hell won't you ever listen to a word I say? The only reason I gave you this address was for you to forward that parcel to me. But the last thing I expected was you to come here of all things. This is crazy. I thought we agreed about this, that for the time being you should stay far away from me. You can never be too cautious, you know, she said, looking rather nervously down the driveway. Are you not just a little pleased to see me? Go on, pet, admit it. Have you not missed me? Of course I haven't missed you. Nor am I pleased to see you, Ryan. You shouldn't be here. You could have been followed. Do you realise that? Do you even care about that? You could be putting me in mortal danger, not to mention yourself. But do you care? Obviously not. If you did care about me, you would stay the hell away. I warned you not to come here, but I should have known you would never ever listen. You couldn't help yourself, could you? You just couldn't help yourself. I'm sorry, but I miss you, pet. It's impossible keeping away from you. You're like a drug to me. I can't get enough of you, and I miss you so much. Well, you're going to have to curb this addiction of yours, or you'll get us both into hot water. And I don't fancy getting boiled alive like a lobster, eaten for breakfast. This is not going to work out if you keep coming around here. How do you know you weren't followed? Someone might have been watching you. You could have led them straight to me. This is a big risk you're taking coming here. There could even be a tracker on your phone or your car. Did you stop to think about that for a moment? I bet you didn't. You can be so lackadaisical, Ryan, about these very important things. You have no idea what I'm up against, what these ruthless people are capable of. I haven't told you half of it, Ryan, to spare you the gruesome details, but believe me, you don't want to know. I'm not stupid, Petal. Don't cast me in such a negative light. I admit it, someone put a tracker on my cell, but I didn't bring my cell with me today. I'm using a burner phone instead to be on the safe side. And the car I used to get here belongs to a good friend of mine, so there can't be a tracker on it. I took great precautions to come here today, and I assure you, I don't believe anyone could have been following me. But if they put a tracker on your cell, what else could they potentially do, Ryan? Tracking technology today is very sophisticated. Don't underestimate these people. They'll stop at nothing to find me. I can promise you that. These people don't give up in a hurry. Don't you get that, Ryan? Don't you realise what I've been dealing with? But it's been 5 years, Petal. Surely they have other things to concern themselves with these days, that you're not the complete focus of all their attention. Petty almost growled at Ryan. Give up? Are you kidding, Ryan? People like this, they never give up. While Dirk Underwood is languishing in that prison, he has people on the outside working for him, eager to do his bidding. They've been looking for me for years, Ryan. There are eyes absolutely everywhere. You cannot be too careful. Dirk Underwood will not rest until he's got to me, until I'm pushing up the daisies. Why do you think that I was given a brand new identity, and why I was under a witness protection program for so long, and still would be if I hadn't finally put my foot down? The authorities know all too well that my life is in grievous danger, and so is yours, just by your association with me. You're only alive because they need you at the moment, to hopefully lead them directly to me. If they hurt you, they upset me, and Dirk Underwood would be very happy to see that happen, as he wants to inflict as much pain on me, emotionally and physically, as possible. For that very reason, even my own parents are living under protective custody with brand new identities. This has affected my entire family. It's been insanely tough on the all of us. And I don't need you throwing a spanner in the works like this. Sometimes I wonder why I did what I did. Why I testified against one of the most dangerous movers and shakers in that drug cartel. Every day, every single day, I'm living in abject terror of my life, wondering if this is the day that I'm going to be hung, drawn and quartered. And I want you to know one thing, Ryan. When they kill me, it's going to be a slow, painful death. They're not going to put me out of my misery quickly. No, They're going to make me suffer."
You did what you did for your brother Petal, because you're incredibly brave. You've got a lion heart. You wanted to avenge Simon's murder. And Dirk Underwood put your brother's head in a plastic bag. That monster, that grotesque evil monster, is now behind bars. And that's a very good start. He killed your brother in such a barbaric, savage way. And thanks to your courageously testifying in court against him, he's behind bars for the rest of his earthly life. Good riddance to bad rubbish. That's exactly what he deserves. I'm only upset that he never got the death penalty. It's a pity in New York State the death penalty was found unconstitutional since 2004, I believe. And that's why those thugs were operating here, in New York State. They knew if they were caught, they'd never ever be sentenced to death. It was clever thinking on their parts, if you ask me. Covering their backs, so to speak. But that man, he got everything he deserved.
"Yes, but you don't get it, Ryan. Everything that I did is for what? Tell me, what's it for? I'll never get my brother Simon back. Never, never. He's never coming back to me. He's gone for good. Why the hell did I get involved with such dangerous people? So volatile. And to think that I testified in court against that Dirk Underwood. And believed that after I'd done such a thing, that I could live a normal life. There was such delusional thinking on my part. I was so incredibly naive, so ignorant. I don't even know what normal is anymore."
You know very well why Simon got involved with them, Petal. He was completely addicted to drugs. He couldn't pay up, so they recruited him to work for them and to do their bidding. And when he let them down in some way, they brutally murdered him by way of example. That's what they do in the drug cartels, you know. So that people get the message, if you mess with us, this is what's going to happen to you. Do you know how many bodies they found under that warehouse floor? Victims of Dirk Underwood. Too many to count, I believe.
If I'd known the kind of life that I would lead after testifying against Dirk Underwood, I don't think I'd have done it all. I didn't know it would be this tough. You know, wasn't I crazy to pretend to be that man's girlfriend? So that I could find out everything about him? Because I've seen things, Ryan, that would make your skin crawl. Do you know I go to bed at night and I can't sleep? I'm always having nightmares because of that man.
Believe me, I know exactly what you've been through, Petal.
No, you don't. That's the problem, Ryan. You're clueless. You have no idea.
You're worrying too much, Petal. I mean, look at you. Your appearance has changed significantly since the surgery. I mean, you look completely different, don't you? I'm your boyfriend, for goodness sake, and I barely recognize you. Your nose is straight, your cheeks more defined, and you never had a tan before. Even if they were to see you, they'd never recognize you. You've got a new identification, a brand new name, a brand new appearance. No one would know who you are, even if they were to follow me here. They would think I was visiting a distant cousin or friend. They'd never guess it was you in a million years. I'm quite sure of that.
I wouldn't be so sure, Ryan, said Petty, shaking her head defiantly. I'm not the first person to use plastic surgery to change my appearance, you know. Nor will I be the last. It's the biggest and oldest trick in the book. These people are cunning. They're ruthless. They'll stop at nothing to find me. Surely even you realise that now. And even if I don't look like the person they're looking for, they'll stop at nothing to ensure that they are absolutely certain that I am not her. And if they see you visiting me here, they know you were my boyfriend, and that my so-called relationship with Dirk Underwood was just a farce. They've been hoping and praying that you'll lead them straight to me. Don't you get that? I was told never ever to get in touch with you again for those specific reasons. I was a fool getting in touch with you again. I've opened a can of worms that I simply cannot close. I was warned to sever all contact with you and anybody else I knew, but I wouldn't listen. I just couldn't do it. Because you love me, Petal, and I love you. And we've got each other's backs. It's not that simple, Ryan. You've got to believe me. These people, they're far more clever and cunning than you can actually appreciate. I don't think you realise that. But they won't find you, will they? This is a small, unassuming town. No one would ever come here looking for you. I mean, this is a town not many people even know exists. That's why you came to live here, is it not? I'm not sure coming to a small town was actually a good idea after all, Ryan. Why do you say that? Because people are very curious about me. I seem to have drawn so much attention to myself. Everybody wants to greet me. Everybody wants to ask me questions. Everybody wants to know about me and my life. I was warned about this, but I didn't pay attention. I didn't listen. I'm so mulishly stubborn. I'm always doing my own thing, so impulsively. I never ever listen to sound, judicious advice. And I feel like a fish out of water in this small town. And I've got such a nosy next-door neighbour. You wouldn't believe that woman. The audacity of her. She is so impertinently asking all these awkward questions about me. And I need that like a hole in the head. She was banging on the door the other day with an apple pie in her hand, trying to get familiar and personally acquainted with me. In a busy metropolis like New York, that would never have happened. Maybe I'm a lot more vulnerable out here than I realise. People look at you. They're naturally fascinated by you. They want to know everything. It's driving me insane. And the more insouciant I become, the more inquisitive they get. But is that a bad thing, Petal? Let's just say, under your new identification, people will never suspect a thing. You can make up an entire fictitious story if you like. The trusting folk in this town will lightly believe every single word of it. You came to this town because you're estranged from your parents. You wanted to get as far away from them as you possibly could. You decided to begin again in this idyllic town. You're an author writing articles for a science magazine. That's why you remain at home all day long, tucked very nicely away in this cute little cottage of yours. You needed a secluded, idyllic place to work. There you go. I've already made up a story for you in a single second. That was all it took. But I can't possibly say that, Ryan. I've already told our nosy next-door neighbour that I'm retired, and she was asking so many awkward questions. Whoa! What did you say? You mean you told your next-door neighbour you're retired? Are you stark raving mad? You are the one telling me to be more discreet. But you're drawing attention to yourself, saying you're retired at such a young age. That's bound to get the tongues in town wagging. I mean, who retires in their 20s, for goodness sake? Well, it's true in a way, isn't it? I mean, I don't actually need to work. I'm just worried about your coming here today, Ryan. It was a dreadful mistake. Are you absolutely 100% certain you weren't being followed? Look at me. Look at my hands. I'm literally shaking and trembling like a leaf. The thought of you being followed here terrifies me. If those wretched people get hold of me, they will not kill me kindly. I hope you realise that. It will be a slow, painful death, as I keep telling you, to maximise their revenge. I'm sure I wasn't followed here, Petal. I'm not stupid. I was very prudent and careful. I would never willingly put the love of my life in danger. But how can you be sure that you weren't followed? I'm as sure as can be. I want you to go, Ryan. I really do. You're putting both of us at risk coming here. If they knew for a moment I was even in the New York State area, they'd think it was Christmas. I told you. We cannot see each other until I feel absolutely certain I'm safe. I know it's hard, but it is what it is. We have to do this for our own safety. For how long, Petal? This is doing my head in. I can't stand being away from you. For as long as necessary, Ryan. I can't promise that we can ever resume where we left off. Sometimes it's better to draw a line in the sand and be done with it. They know you're involved in my life. That puts you in mortal danger. I was such a fool to give you my address, to send me that parcel. I mean, what if they came after you, tried to hurt you, demand you to tell them my location?
They would have to kill me first, Petal, before I told them anything. I would lay down my life for you, and you know that.
You've got to go, Ryan. Please don't talk like this. And for goodness sake, don't come back again if you know what's good for you.
You can't do that to me, Petal. I love you. Can we not at least talk about this? You're not going to invite me in for a drink or something, perhaps? I've been on the road for a long time. I'm parched. This goddamn heat wave is killing me.
I'm sorry, Ryan. I can't encourage you. I know you love me, but right now, I need to be on my own. I can't have a relationship with anyone. I barely get to sleep at night. I'm always looking over my shoulder. Have you any idea what it's like to live in abject fear every single day, wondering whether each day might be your last, which I hasten to say, Ryan, is a very real possibility. And we shouldn't be standing out here talking. Anybody could be listening, especially that nosy next-door neighbour of mine. She's always snooping around in the yard.
But you've had plastic surgery, Petal, and with your tan you're barely recognisable anymore. You used to be fair. It's been 5 years since the court case.
You know the saying, Ryan, an elephant never ever forgets. Dirk Underwood's memory would make an elephant look decidedly small, let me tell you. Besides, that wrathful man thought I loved him. I deceived him well. And to find out I made a fool out of him would certainly stir him up, let me tell you. And he wants revenge, you can be sure of that. In that perfectly inauspicious, inopportune moment, things so often go wrong, and Lilac's pruning shears slipped out of her fingers like butter because it was such a hot day. They fell to the ground with a mighty thud. She hurriedly crouched clandestinely behind the bush, cursing herself for her foolishness. Did you hear that? Oh, my goodness, did you hear that, Ryan? I think somebody's been listening in to our conversation. You better hope that was my next-door neighbour. You better hope that was a nosy old bat, and not someone more consequential.
Don't be ridiculous. It was probably nothing.
It's not nothing. I'm telling you, someone was there. Someone was listening to us. Lilac could sense that her next-door neighbour was now pacing up and down anxiously, peering into her yard. She had hoped her neighbour would not see her cowering there in the bushes, eavesdropping on their conversation. I know I heard a noise. Do you think someone sneaked into my neighbour's property and is furtively listening behind some of her garden shrubs?
You're worrying about nothing, Petal. You're overreacting and being far too dramatic. You're living on tenterhooks, and I understand that. But I believe it's all in your head. You're just a bit jumpy, that's all.
And I wouldn't be jumpy if you hadn't come here today, Ryan. I should never have given you this address. I couldn't trust you, could I? I never expected you to come here to ruin everything. What on earth were you thinking?
I'm so sorry, Petal. You're right. I don't know what I was thinking. I should never have come.
Well, good. I'm glad you realise that, Ryan. You need to go. I'm really sorry to treat you so brusquely like this, but it is for the best. Lilac watched the young man walking to his car rather soberly. Petty called after him. I'm very sorry. It's very nice of you to ask, but as I told you, I've already recruited another garden service. The young man nodded, climbed into his car, lifted his hand in a half-hearted gesture of goodbye, and drove away, probably feeling pretty miserable. Lilac couldn't believe what had just unfolded and everything that she had heard. It would seem her next-door neighbour, Petty Waincroft, was not who she claimed to be. One of the Esther sisters had been right when she'd said maybe her new next-door neighbour was hiding something. It was clear to Lilac that Petty Waincroft was in some kind of very serious trouble, that had certainly required her to be part of a witness protection program that involved protecting herself and immediate members of her own family from some unscrupulous Machiavellian thugs that were part of a scandalously disreputable drug cartel. Ostensibly the venomous ringleader, a man by the name of Dirk Underwood, with a notoriously dangerous and ruthlessly formidable reputation, had indiscriminately murdered Petty Waincroft's brother in cold blood, by way of example, placing his head in a plastic bag to show other members of the cartel that if you mess with me, this is invariably what will happen to you as well. The horrifying imagery brought tears of disgusted revulsion to Lilac's eyes. Petty had pretended to be this noxious mobster's girlfriend in order to find out everything about the drug cartel and their insidious dark secrets, who the movers and shakers invariably were. By the sounds of things, Petty Waincroft, if that was indeed her real name, which Lilac seriously doubted, was living under a different assumed identity, probably given to her by the authorities. She had testified against Dirk Underwood, the ringleader of this drug cartel, who by all accounts was after her to extract his revenge, especially since she had made a fool of him by pretending to be his girlfriend, so she could get as much evidence to use against him to incriminate him in a court of law. It would seem that Lilac's rather unassuming next-door neighbour was, in fact, a steely, very courageous, brave young woman, who would stop at nothing to get back at the malignant man who had vindictively killed her brother. Indeed, she had placed herself in mortal danger, serious enough for her to get her identity completely changed and to opt for plastic surgery to radically alter her appearance. Who would go to those kind of extreme measures unless they really feared for their lives? Lilac suddenly felt a solicitous sympathy for her neighbour, and could now understand why the woman had been so buttoned up, rather remote and unforthcoming, always pushing away the friendliness of the townfolk. She privately thought that from thenceforth she would keep an astute, very careful eye on Petty Waincroft to ensure her neighbour's safety, in case the thugs who were after her, on behalf of their ringleader, who was now languishing in a prison, made an unwelcome appearance in their small town. Lilac knew she was privy to a secret that she could never share with a single solitary soul, for that might put her neighbour's life in serious jeopardy. She wondered why Petty had chosen to come to a small town like this. People were forever asking questions. There was no doubt that tongues were wagging, including Lilac's herself, all about the mysterious new stranger. So far from succeeding in disappearing into the shadows, as Petty Waincroft had obviously hoped she would, she had inadvertently drawn a great deal of unwanted attention to herself. It was almost certainly true that had she been living in a busy metropolis, she could so easily disappear into a large crowd, like one ant among millions. But out here she stuck out like the quintessential sore thumb. So coming to this idyllic part of the world, to a small town like this, may not have been the most judicious decision of all. But it sounded like Petty Waincroft had a mind of her own, had stood up to her well-meaning advisers with a resolute determination to live a free life, which could potentially put her at a precarious risk. The next morning, when Lilac knew that Petty was taking her normal jog in the woodgrove, like she did early every morning, before the sun fully came out, Lilac decided that she would surreptitiously follow the young lady into the woods and go for a casual stroll herself. It would be good to step up her exercise regime, which was pretty non-existent. Increase her fitness, perhaps. Everybody said walking was the best exercise for your health, didn't they? There was no doubt in Lilac's mind that Buddy would almost certainly appreciate a good walk when the temperatures remained cool, which would not be for terribly long. Buddy had not been able to walk for quite a while, as he had sustained a rather mysterious limp to his right leg, but was fully recovered, and the vet had actively encouraged Lilac to take him for walks. There was no time like the present, she decided. Buddy's tail began to thump excitedly when Lilac put on his collar and lead, and moments later Lilac saw the willowy figure of Petty running past her cottage, jogging towards the cul-de-sac at the end of the road, which led up to the trail that opened out into a sprawling grove of trees that went on for ever and ever, it would seem. She knew she wanted to keep an eye on Petty, so Lilac astutely followed the young woman, with Buddy by her side. If she bumped into Petty in the woods, she would feign surprise and say something casual like, "Oh, fancy seeing you here, Petty. What a lovely surprise. I didn't know you came running into the woods. I often go here for a walk, you know." Some people could call her a snoop. If Lilac's daughter Bernice was still alive, and had not so inauspiciously died of sickle cell anemia all those years ago, she'd likely be round about Petty's age by now. So Lilac felt oddly protective towards the young lady, especially after unfortunately having eavesdropped in on a very disquieting conversation a day prior, a conversation that she should never have heard. This had left her feeling distinctly unsettled and very troubled about the safety of her next-door neighbour. She had a dreadful foreboding feeling in the pit of her gut that something quite awful might become of the young lady. As Lilac thought long and hard about her next-door neighbour, she felt like she'd become a character caught up in a mystery thriller and suspense novel, which in its own peculiar way was rather exciting, if not a little bit disorientating, as things like this did not usually happen in this unassuming, very demure town, where time went by at a leisurely pace and the community was relaxed and carefree. This was not the kind of hotspot on the map of New York State, where you would expect something wildly dangerous to happen. But life can surprise you when you least expect it to, and little did Lilac know that things were going to get a whole lot more bizarre, so much so that in the years to come she'd be asking herself again and again, "Did that really happen?" It was about 5 years after Lilac's daughter's passing that her husband Niles had also tragically passed away. It had been devastating for Lilac, but she believed he died from a broken heart, as losing their beloved daughter was too much for him. It had torn him up into shreds, and he'd never been the same man after that. Of course she didn't blame him for that. Parents were never expected to outlive their own children. Niles had simply lost the will to live any more, and like some of the scorched roses on a very hot day, she had watched Niles wilt away, slowly fading away into obscurity from the world, like the bleached ink on a canvas, until he was no more, so that Lilac had lost the two most beloved people in her life. These days her golden retriever Buddy had become like a child to her. Sadly now he too was becoming old. As Lilac gingerly navigated her way down the sandy path of the cul-de-sac, there was a buoyant skip to her step. She swung her arms energetically backwards and forwards to energize her movements, passing a few familiar whitewashed cottages along the way that were all huddled closely together side by side, like old friends. Lilac knew everybody very well that lived in these cottages, but all was serenely quiet and undisturbed at this early hour of the morning, and the soft light dappled the cottages in a pretty glow. It was about 5 to 6. She finally reached the end of the cul-de-sac and sashayed up a slightly precarious steep hilly incline, littered by loose stones, patches of grass, and the occasional cluster of rambling wild flowers that mischievously poked their bright little heads through the stony soil. Buddy had his nose pinned to the ground, as if he'd picked up an intriguing scent that rather tickled his fancy, so his tail was wagging excitedly. Once they got to the top of the hilly slope, the ground cordially and rather graciously appeared to even itself out, becoming distinctly flatter and easier to walk. It stretched itself out widely, like an all-encompassing yawn, opening out into many different footpaths. Too many to choose from if you were a novice or a stranger to the area, for this was a wood-grove that could happily invite you to get completely lost, for it was like a never-ending maze of trees. Lilac and Buddy followed the familiar long windy footpath that was thankfully very clearly marked, and seemed to beckon them through the tall lofty trees, inviting them to enter under the shaded canopy of this verdant oasis. It was here that Lilac let Buddy off the lead. Her dog went gratefully charging down the trail, heavily scattered with pine needles and the mulched leaves from the previous fall. The black soil she walked across was richly fertile under her boots. Buddy was probably on pursuit of a rabbit or something, which would be so typical of him. As being a retriever, he loved to chase, and retrieved anything that dared to move. There were times her incorrigible retriever had spontaneously dropped a dead animal at her feet, like a ball, almost as if Buddy expected Lilac to throw it for him, to chase, but Lilac stayed the hell away from any decaying dead bodies, especially when they became rancidly putrid, and Buddy had a penchant for picking out the smelliest things he could find in the grove. Sometimes it took days to get the smell of decomposition out of Buddy's soft golden coat, even after numerous washes, because that vile smell seemed to hang around like an unwelcome guest you could never get rid of. I really should exercise more often. This wood grove is magnificent, Lilac thought to herself. I've forgotten how good it is to come for a walk in the morning like this, she thought, enjoying the fresh feeling of the crisp, gentle breeze blowing against her cheeks. The air was injected with the rich smell of pine terpenes, and the pretty trill of the dawn chorus high up in the trees seemed to lift the whole ambience of the woods. The morning light prettily sprinkled itself through the branches of the trees, making the rich foliage adorning the branches look like a green overcoat of tassels that appeared to be glistening. The footpath was swathed in a gossamer golden light, and the foliage under all the trees appeared to be dappled in a silvery dew that clung to the leaves like glitter. Lilac trudged through the trees, beating the ground heavily with her boots, for she was not desperately light on her feet, so if anybody was around, they would likely hear her coming. She felt reasonably invigorated, refreshed, and really appreciative of the rich, lush foliage that swaddled her on every side. So much so she almost forgot the real reason she'd come here, which was to follow her neighbour. Her current enjoyment had seized her distraction. Her focus was otherwise engaged in this charming, prepossessing moment. Rabbits merrily bounded down the footpath, and a rambunctious, overzealous Buddy gave them all chase. His infectious enthusiasm made Lilac all but chuckle. Lilac observed squirrels darting up trees, looking down at her mischievously through dark, spirited but inquiring eyes, studying her rather curiously, as if her presence invited great interest. At one point Buddy stopped at a tree. He sat back on his haunches, looking up at a branch. He began to whine with an urgent eagerness. "What is it, Buddy?" asked Lilac. "There's nothing there, boy. Now let's carry on with our walk, shall we?" Buddy did not move. His eyes were steadfastly fixed on a tree branch. He continued to whine. Lilac then followed Buddy's obsessed gaze, and that was when she observed a couple of dead rabbits hanging by their floppy necks on a tree branch, with leather thongs tied around their necks that had been tied to the branch by a rather peculiar-looking leather thong of some kind. The rabbits looked suspiciously like they'd only been recently strangled. There were no signs of any gunshot injuries on them, which was decidedly strange. Lilac could only think that some unscrupulous poacher had recently killed the poor little mites, with the full intention of eating them. He was leaving them on the branch to retrieve later, while wantonly continuing with his illegal poaching. How strange, Lilac thought, studying the dead rabbits closely. She was wondering how a man could possibly be fast enough to catch up to a rabbit and then strangle it, as that didn't make any sense at all, unless the man himself owned a dog that caught the rabbits on his behalf, and then he strangled them. But by all accounts, when she looked closer, she could see there were no teeth marks on the rabbits from a dog's incisors. So how had these rabbits been killed? So much like a domestic chicken would be, with their necks twisted, hanging limp from their bodies. She took it upon herself to touch one of them. It was still warm, as she had suspected it would be. These rabbits were as fresh as the day was new. She could hardly believe it. She was meditating on the peculiarity of this rather bizarre situation, when out of nowhere a small stone went flying towards her, followed by another, and another. It gave her quite the start. She was being liberally showered with a ubiquitous spray of stones, almost as if someone wanted her to get the hell away from their dead rabbits. Lilac called out, "I'm not going to take your rabbits if that's what you're worried about. I'm going now." And as she spoke, everything calmed, and the stormy, indignant outburst of showery stones suddenly stopped. "What the hell?" she thought. "Some deranged poacher in the woods, who's killed the rabbits, is afraid that I'm going to take them for myself. Steal his quarry, so to speak. I'd never do that. All the meat I eat, I purchase from Mr. Medcoff in town, and rabbit is never on my menu." Lilac thought to herself, although she had been told by Mr. Medcoff that rabbit tastes exactly like chicken. "I know, because my grandfather grew up in the countryside in England during the Second World War. They used to regularly kill rabbits to eat, because they were on food stamps and there was a lot of rationing, so they didn't get a lot of meat every week. He told me that the rabbits tasted exactly like chicken." Buddy was barking excitedly, as if he could see something that Lilac's eyes had failed to observe. What was he barking at, she wondered curiously. He seemed unusually excited, very invigorated, and was wildly thrashing his tail, like he did when he met locals or friends on the street, all who had a soft spot for the lovable retriever. Buddy's dark eyes were fixed on some burgeoning shrubbery, and he continued to bark and bark and bark. Lilac suddenly remembered, at one time a few years back, a vagrant had been seen living in the woods here. Everyone in town knew all about him. He had been called Mad Mike. Some folks thought he was slightly unhinged and not in his right mind. He'd often be seen sitting outside the butcher's with a cap in hand, begging for money. The rumour was he lost everything he'd owned after his wife died, so that his life fell apart, and then he turned to drink for solace. As a consequence, he lost his job and his home, and ended up completely homeless. Lilac had seen him once when walking her dog Buddy. He had grinned at her, with a gormless but wide gummy smile. Many of his teeth were missing on the front row, and the smile had made him look like a real simpleton. The man had dressed like a dishevelled scarecrow, wearing pants that were several inches too short for him, and an old, heavily patched tweed blazer that had almost certainly seen better days. In Lilac's humble opinion, he had always looked as if he'd been lying in a bed of leaves. His hair was always tangled up with leafy debris. One of the locals in town had accidentally stumbled across his camping site, quite by chance, when taking the wrong turning in the woodgrove. They'd seen his washing drying close to a creek, spread out across several branches. They'd observed a fire pit and a pile of bones from the animals he'd killed with a slingshot. Mad Mike was considered completely harmless, but not quite right in the head. People left him well alone, many feeling rather sorry for the poor man. But then one day no one saw Mad Mike again. People automatically assumed he'd moved away. Lilac privately wondered if Mad Mike was still very much around and had become increasingly more feral over the years, which would explain why he'd thrown the stones at her, so that she wouldn't go anywhere near his rabbits. I mean, you heard of human beings like that, didn't you? Lilac shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly, urging Buddy along down the footpath ahead of her. But she could not shake the foreboding feeling that she was being clandestinely watched. She wondered if Mad Mike was furtively hiding in the shadows, gormlessly watching her like a half-crazed maniac. The thought made her cringe. "He must be back," she thought to herself, "or maybe he never left in the first place." It certainly explained the appearance of the dead rabbits. Maybe the man had become a nifty hunter. She half expected to stumble across a couple of empty bottles of rum lying among the trees, but saw no signs of obvious litter to suggest Mad Mike was still around. And he had had a reputation for drinking an excess of rum, which was his go-to alcoholic beverage. Lilac and Buddy had really enjoyed their walk together, but now it was time to return back to the house. So when Lilac and Buddy retreated on their steps, going back the initial way that they had come, Lilac noticed that the rabbits that were hanging on the branch of the tree had all but vanished. Mad Mike must have taken them away, she thought. He was obviously incredibly protective over his food. As Lilac walked through the grove, the back of her neck began to burn. The feeling as if someone's eyes were drilling into the back of her skull was very apparent to her. She was certain she was being watched. She knew it with every fibre of her being. For a brief second, she turned around, and then she saw him. But it happened so fast, she thought she must be imagining it. She had to be. She wasn't used to getting up this early. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But in that poignant moment, time stood still. Standing there, larger than life, next to a tall, lofty pine tree, she had seen a shadowy figure with a pyramid-shaped head, ponderous shoulders, overlong arms, and with dark eyes that were staring at her. It was a Bigfoot. She could hardly believe it. In one hand, the Bigfoot was holding a couple of rabbits. He lifted up the rabbits to show Lilac, as if to say, "These are mine. Don't think for a moment you can help yourself to my food. Don't get any ideas." At that, the Bigfoot turned around and promptly glided back into the woods. Lilac rubbed her eyes, thinking, "Did I really see that?" By the end of the day, she had convinced herself it had all but been a trick of the light. Petty Waincroft, Petty, whose real name was Susan Nettles, began awkwardly pacing up and down the passageway of Wispy Wind Cottage that she had bought on a whim, against the professional advice of the Witness Protection Program. The seasoned professionals on the program thought she might be drawing attention to herself, moving to a small town where nobody knew who she was. It was better to merge into a busy cosmopolitan city where strangers were so commonplace so that no one would give you a fleeting or even passing thought. And in such a place, with a high populace, it was common not even to know your neighbours. Susan fancied living in the countryside, far away from it all, as for far too long she had felt like a bird cooped up in a gilded cage, with clipped wings that prevented her from flying. She had shunned the obvious claustrophobia she was feeling in her safely guarded life. At the time it had seemed like a bright idea to buy Wispy Wind Cottage on the spur of the moment. She had fallen hard for the place, once she had viewed it online, for it had tickled her wistful fancies, as she'd always rather liked the idea of living in a small town in the countryside. Now she wasn't exactly sure that moving here had been a sensible idea after all. Perhaps she should have listened more attentively to her advisers. People here in the small town were naturally curious about her, and had not been adverse to asking her awkward questions, especially that annoying, impertinent woman next door, who called herself Lilac Evans, who seemed to take great delight in virtually interrogating her. Susan had wantonly rebelled against the stringent rules of the Witness Protection Program, and at the end of the day it was her life, and no one could really take her freedom away from her against her will. They had agreed with her on this one, it was true, but they had warned her that some of her choices might be her greatest undoing, and if she ended up lying dead in a ditch, it would be on her head. They could give her the best advice for her own good, but if she chose not to listen to it, then it was her call. For the last 5 years, she had been living a very sheltered existence. It would seem she had testified in court against Dirk Underwood and against the most heavyweight thugs in a notoriously cutthroat drug cartel. She knew from thenceforth she'd never be entirely free again, especially while the ringleader Dirk Underwood was still around, still calling the shots from behind his prison cell. She knew that there would always be a price on her head, while that nauseating, insufferable man languished away in prison like an odious, bad, rotting stench that would never ever abate. How did I manage to pretend to be his girlfriend, she wondered. How did I even pull that stunt off? Because she could never do that again. She was grateful to have been legitimately given a brand new identity, and to be living under a new name, a name she'd chosen for herself, that once again she thought drew attention to herself. She should have stuck for something a little bit more simple, perhaps. She had been able to have plastic surgery to change her appearance, but was it enough? She wasn't exactly sure that it was. Would she ever feel safe again in her own skin? She was constantly nervously looking over her shoulders, expecting to see a dark hooded stranger creeping behind her, ready to pounce on her unawares. It was rather ironic that even if she looked different on the outside, on the inside she felt exactly the same, and that was part of the problem. Despite the fact that everything about her was strikingly different, she had lost a whole lot of weight, she was no longer blonde, and all her sunbathing had eliminated her former fair complexion. But the neighbour was absolutely right. If she wasn't careful, she might end up getting skin cancer. So sunbathing all day on her deck was probably complete folly. She hated Dirk Underwood with a burning passion, for he had been the man that had brutally killed her brother Simon. And for what? Her brother had failed to get payment for a large supply of drugs, and that had been that. Why had her brother got embroiled with such evil, malicious men? Of course she knew the answer to that question painfully well. Simon would probably have sold his soul to the devil to support his drug habit. So the cartel had used him just the way they wanted. She had seen her beloved brother wretchedly consumed by his drug addiction. He had become like a shadow of his former self, the brother she had known and loved throughout her entire childhood, fading before her eyes, like invisible ink disappearing on a white page. There were moments when Simon had said to her, "What the hell is happening to me? Look what a lowlife I've become. All this is not me. This is not me, Susan. But it's like the drugs. They've taken me over. It's like a demon inside of me that has to be exorcised. But I don't know how to get rid of it. I wish I could get rid of it. I wish I didn't have to work for these evil men, Susan. You have no idea what they're capable of. You have no idea what they're like. But I've got myself between a rock and a hard place, and there's nothing I can do about this." Simon had had a bright future ahead of him, an opportunity to reach for the stars, for he had been an extraordinary songwriter with the potential to go very far. But this desire to write songs dissipated under the addiction, and his creative genius had been eaten alive by the drugs. Dirk Underwood had made an example of Simon by slicing off his head with a machete when he failed to deliver on his promises, and his head had been found in a bag in somebody's dumpster. It was a message for Mark Underwood to all those under his charge. "Don't mess with me, or this will happen to you," which meant everybody was afraid of the man. Susan had gone out of a limb to seduce the unsuspecting Dirk Underwood, and he had fallen hard for her charms, not knowing that she was the sister of one of the men he had deliberately slain. The rest was history, of course, as Susan had spilled the beans on the cartel, testified against the ringleader. She had gone all the way to do this on behalf of her late brother, to put the evil man responsible for his death behind bars, by secretly recording some of his conversations with her about what he'd done. But even though he was now in prison, he had his minions outside the prison walls doing his bidding, and he wanted Susan and her family dead, so they'd all gone into hiding in fear for their lives. Susan had seduced the unsuspecting Dirk Underwood. He had fallen hard for her charms, not knowing that she was the sister of one of the men he had deliberately slain. The rest was, of course, history. Susan had naturally spilled the beans on the cartel, testifying against Dirk Underwood. She had gone out of a limb for her late brother, to put the man responsible for his death behind bars for good, by secretly recording some of her conversations with him about what he'd done to her brother. But even though he was now in prison, he had his minions outside prison walls doing his bidding, and he wanted Susan Nettles and her entire family dead, so they'd all gone into hiding in fear for their lives under the Witness Protection Program. More recently, after what you might describe as a 5-year leave of absence, Susan had rather recklessly started communicating with her long-lost boyfriend Ryan, after he thought she had disappeared off the face of the earth, when she'd slipped out of his life, rather like the melted butter sliding down a corn cob. She'd been told by the Witness Protection Program to sever all ties with her previous contacts, as reconnecting with them could be potentially very dangerous for her. but Susan had been unable to resist the allure of contacting her lost love, and wanting nothing more than to rekindle the relationship, which in hindsight had been a rather foolish thing to do, that she was beginning to regret. She had met up with Ryan at a secret rendezvous on several occasions, until Ryan realized that he had been stalked by a member of the drug cartel, who was under Dirk Underwood's influences. They had obviously learned that Ryan might have been in touch with his ex-girlfriend again, so the man had been carefully watched. Susan knew that they would stop at nothing to find her, for they wanted revenge, to make her pay for what she had done by betraying Dirk Underwood and his duplicitous schemes to the authorities and testifying against him in court. She was the quintessential reason the big movers and shakers in that drug cartel were now behind bars. She was the one responsible for putting them there, and with good reason. But now, even 5 years on, her life was still on the line. Susan had gained great pleasure listening to the hell and damnation preaching that she had found on the radio. She liked the preacher's sermons, and would get satisfying images of Dirk Underwood and his wicked minions suffocating in that lake of fire. Thoughts like that made her hope that hell was a real place, for she would certainly like to throw those evil men in the lake, for they had been responsible for so many disappearances, horrifyingly brutal murders and atrocities. In order to feel safe living her daily life, she had been given a sizable amount of money, so that she could lead an independent life without having to necessarily work if she chose not to. She had been advised that moving to a small town, in the very state where some of the cartel were now imprisoned, might indeed draw attention to her, the unwanted kind of attention. But she had been tired of listening to all the well-meaning advice that had left her feeling like a wild mare tethered to its stall. She had wanted to break free, which might come at a cost that she was unwilling to really pay. It was too late to look back on the path she had now chosen to take, with scattered regrets, defeated hopes, and restless nights. She couldn't backtrack now. She wanted to live this life independently from now on, and even if she was in mortal danger, she had thought it well worth the risk. But now she was not so sure. Was her bravery rather like a prickly pear in her hand, and now she wasn't liking the way her hand was beginning to feel. She certainly felt frustrated after Ryan had fortuitously paid her a visit at Wispy Wind Cottage. She knew giving him her address had been a foolish thing to do, especially after they had gleaned that some of the dark underbelly of Dirk Underwood's associates had been keeping close tabs on him, in the hope that Ryan himself might lead them directly to her, after having got wind of Ryan having got back together with a former girlfriend, which many suspected was Susan Nettles herself. "I do love you, Ryan, but we can't see each other any more," Susan had informed him. "We just can't. It's far too dangerous, and I care about you too much to pursue this relationship." Ryan had agreed to cut ties with the love of his life, but now, like a lamb to the slaughter, he had fortuitously chosen to visit her at her new address when she'd specially told him not to. Susan could not shake off the gut-wrenching, bodeful feeling that he had unwillingly, despite his very best efforts to be scrupulously careful, brought danger to her front door. Ryan was insistent that no one had followed him to her cottage that day. But how? How could he be sure about that? These notoriously evil scoundrels had friends in high places. They were cunningly clever, resourceful, manipulative, and Susan had a sense that she was now living on borrowed time. Every morning Susan would get up really early for her morning jog. She had found the perfect footpath at the end of the cul-de-sac on the street that led through acres and acres of sprawling woods. There were lots of footpaths to take, but she chose one that she used every single day. It was the perfect place to stretch her legs out, to let her hair down without being the object of anybody's scrutiny. Susan found that jogging helped her to abandon all her troubles for a while and let them go, almost as if for a brief moment she could become somebody else that was not plagued with so much disquiet. Jogging kept her sane, as did speaking to her parents regularly on a burner phone, as they were also in hiding. They were very glad that Dirk Underwood had got his just deserts and would be rotting away in prison for the rest of his life and would never see the light of day again. It would seem they thought that Susan had lost leave of her senses, moving to the small town, but it was something she had wanted to do, especially after falling in love with the dreamy cottage that she had seen online. It was such a perfect cottage, exactly what she'd always wanted, and she didn't believe that she had stumbled on it by chance. She didn't believe in things like that. She believed in serendipity, and she couldn't help but wonder if in some way her deceased brother Simon had beckoned to her from beyond the grave, indicating that this cottage was calling her name and was meant for her. Sometimes even fate could give you a nudge in the right direction. The young man who had posted the cottage online to sell as soon as he possibly could had been very honest and upfront with Susan, told her that his mother had owned the property and had died in the front yard from a terrified reaction to a rat of all things. And Susan was sure she could feel the old lady's nurturing presence around her, which was oddly reassuring, even if it was probably all in her head.
I don't understand, love, why you bought that cottage, dear. On the spur of the moment like that. It's absolute madness, complete madness. You know that this is not a good idea in the circumstances. I'm sure the place is perfectly lovely, bewitching even. But I'm sorry, love, you're drawing attention to yourself. You really are. In my experience, people in small towns can't help themselves but talk. They're going to find it very strange that you move to their town on a whim like this. You don't work. You keep yourself privately to yourself. Many tongues will be wagging. Let me tell you, I know. People will ask impertinent questions. It can become incredibly awkward for you. Me and your father haven't gone through all of this insufferable identity change to lose you like this. We've already lost Simon. We can't lose you as well, my dear. My heart just can't stand it.
Ma'am, I simply just cannot live under that program anymore. You don't know how it makes me feel. I feel completely suffocated. Surely you realize that.
We all feel suffocated, love. This is not a very pleasant experience for any of us. But you've got a price on your head. You can't ignore that fact. You do what you have to do to survive.
Ma'am, I've been incredibly careful. What do you expect me to do?
I expect you to remain on the program, love. Not to cause such pandemonium and chaos in your wake. Everybody is terribly upset with you. I hope you know what you've done. They've never experienced anyone as headstrong as you before. You want to do your own thing, despite and to hell with the consequences. I'm sorry, love. Your attitude stinks. Sometimes you can be incredibly naive. That's all I'm going to say.
Ma'am, I'm prepared to take a risk and live my life the way I want to. I want to be free. I don't want to be answerable to anybody.
But you are never free, love. You'll be always looking over your shoulders, no matter where you live. The only time you will ever be free is when Dirk Underwood himself is dead. And by the sounds of things, that ain't going to be happening for a very long time. Beyond everything else, love, you've moved back to New York State. I mean, of all the places in the world to move, and I don't care how large a state it is. You put yourself right under the radar of those heavy-duty thugs. And I just don't understand you at all. I cannot believe that you got in touch with Ryan again. I mean, of all the stupid and foolish things to do, that has got to be the most dangerous. I mean, sometimes I wonder, love, if you have a death wish or something. You know the rules of the program. You were never supposed to contact anyone from your past, to leave a trail behind you. It's not worth the risk. What do you think you were doing?
Oh, Mum, please stop going on. I love him. Do you really expect me to give him up?
Yes, love, I do. Sometimes you do what you have to do. This is not worth risking your life over.
Those minions work for Dirk Underwood, outside the prison, and they're around, believe me, they are. And they will be watching Rand's every single move. I hope you realize that. These people have eyes in the back of their head. They don't miss a trick. And God forbid, if they caught up with you, love, which is a very real possibility, if Ryan leads them directly to you, I don't even want to think about what they will do to you. The idea makes my skin crawl. Believe me, love, killing you quickly would be a merciful thing to do, and they will spare you no mercy. They will kill you as slowly as possible to maximize your pain. Do you understand that? Do you even comprehend what these men are capable of? They're animals, love. They're not human.
Ma'am, don't you think I don't know that? I was Dirk Underwood's girlfriend for a while, do you not remember? He told me everything he did. I can't believe how evil he was. I'm not naive as you keep saying I am. I know what these people are like. I know how dangerous my life is. Wherever I go, I've got to watch my back. I am in danger. But you know what? Sometimes it's worth the risk living like this, because at least I'm freer than I ever was under the program. And yes, they might think I'm insufferable, and they might think I'm headstrong and mulishly stubborn. But you know what? I don't care what they think. I need to do what's right for me, Mum. And I really don't want to meditate on all the things that could go wrong. Because you know what? It's all I ever think about. It's what consumes my every thought. I'm always living, Mum, on tender hooks, always afraid of what tomorrow might hold. But you know what? I'd rather live like this than the way I was living before. You wouldn't have to, love, if you hadn't rebelled against the program the way you did. I mean, at the very least, you could have moved into a very busy area with a high populace, for goodness sake. But no, you couldn't even do that. I mean, I spoke to the advisors and they said to me that they can't stop you from doing what you want because you're a free person. But look at you. What are you like? Mr. Woebegone. Oh, he said he couldn't force you to do anything you didn't want. But I wish he could do something. I mean, you were in witness protection for your own good, love. But he couldn't force you to remain on the program. You're free to make your own choices. But you know what else he told me? No, go on. You're dying to tell me. Say it. Do I have to hear it anyway?
Yes, I think you do, love, for your own good. He said he wouldn't even give you 6 months on the outside, that something would likely happen to you to expose your whereabouts. He wasn't happy that you've been in touch with Ryan. He said that is going to be incredibly dangerous, being in touch with him. That's all I can say, love.
He said all that, did he?
Yes, love, he did. How do you think it made me feel? Your father was beside himself, but I won't go on about that now. I hate to say it, but he's right, that man is. He knows what he's talking about. He's been doing the witness protection program for a very long time. He knows about those wicked, duplicitous people. They will stop at nothing to find you, and then they will punish you, love, for testifying against Dirk Underwood.
That sounds ominous.
That's an understatement, love. I was devastated, absolutely devastated. If I lose you, Susan, I lose my will to live. I hope you realize that. Be this on your own back. I hope you can live with that. You can't do this to us, love. Do you know I can't sleep at night? I worry about you so much. Please come back on the program. Put that cottage on the market.
Mum, don't be so dramatic. And even if I was killed by Dirk Underwood's minions, at least you would always know that I'd made my own free choices in the end. That should be a God-given right to us all, don't you think? To be free to make our own choices. I mean, why should I be imprisoned in my own life for what Dirk Underwood did to Simon? Why must I pay for his crime by losing my freedom as well? I've lost so much already. My brother, my friends, my former appearance, seeing you and Dad as often as I would have liked. And by the looks of things,
I may have even lost Ryan. Why should I lose all this? Everything I love, because of that cold-hearted thug. I hate him. I hope he rots in hell. What do you think it feels like, Mum, to look in the mirror every single morning and to be staring back at a face that no longer I recognise? I miss my blonde hair and my slightly pointed off-centred nose. I can't believe I'm saying that, because I used to hate that old nose of mine. Now I think it was cute, but I can never have that nose back. I can never have my old looks back again. I have even gone so far as to bake my skin in the sun to alleviate my former fair complexion, at the very high risk of getting skin cancer. And I liked my skin fair. I suited fair skin. I don't like looking like a roasted pumpkin, but I've done everything I can think of, and it's still not enough, is it? I rue the day that I ever testified in court against that man. Why didn't somebody warn me what would happen as a consequence of this? I never knew how high the cost would be, that I'd have to pay for my own personal freedom, just to put that man behind bars. I feel exactly like a tiger in a cage, as if I'm trapped in my own life. I can't do this anymore. I just can't, Mum. I'm always looking over my shoulder, always feeling afraid. When is it ever going to stop? Well, love, it's what we're all in for at the moment. Me and your father understand your frustration. We really do. But we're very proud of you at the same time. What you did on behalf of Simon, even though he is no longer with us, was incredibly brave. You stood up against the vindictive evil man and his atrocities, and that you should be very, very proud of. And you put him behind bars. Don't forget that in a hurry. I just wish you weren't so obstinate, Susan. I think your frustration has rubbed off on your father as well. Honestly, the two of you were driving me completely potty, and you're making this terribly difficult. Your father is now threatening to break free from the program as well. He's had enough. The Witness Protection Program are thinking of relocating us to live in a heavy populated area, to merge very slowly and progressively into society there, which will give us more freedom. But I'm not happy about it. I feel a lot safer where we are right now.
Susan knew her mother was absolutely right. Her mother was definitely the sane one in their family. There was a restless stubbornness to her character that she definitely inherited from her father's side of the family, which gave her a desire to make a brand new life for herself in this small town. And she was determined that come hell or high water, she'd make it work. Maybe she should take Ryan's advice, be more friendly to the locals, make up some cock and bull fictitious story about having escaped a rather abusive family, and being a writer looking for a private retreat to be inspired to write articles for a science magazine. Could she pull it off, she wondered. She wasn't sure, but she had to give it a bash. At least the locals would then have something to chew on, before she drew even more unwanted attention to herself. The following morning, after her rather sombre conversation with her mother, Susan got up early for her routine jog. She was filled with what she could only describe as a growing sense of trepidation and unease. She wasn't sure whether her mother's cautionary words had struck a chord with her, so that now she was doubting her ambitiously courageous decision to live in this small town. However, on this morning, other things were at play, almost as if something or someone was trying to urge her not to leave her property this morning. For starters, she had been unable to find her front door key, which she always left on the hook next to the door. But on this morning, she found it after a frantic search. It had fallen under the hall table, and was hiding in such an obscure position, almost as if someone had deliberately placed it there, so that she would not see it. Luckily, she had found it. It had never fallen off the hook like this before, and disappeared from plain sight. "Don't be ridiculous," she scolded herself. "You're reading far too much into this. You always overthink things, Susan. You can't keep living on tender hooks like this. It'll drive you mad. You know you need this morning jog. It'll help you relax.
But even as she left the house for her jog, a nagging little voice in her head kept urging her to go back home. But she chose to ignore it, as her desire to go for a jog was like an itch she needed to scratch, or an unquenchable thirst she needed to satisfy. Before long she was jogging down the cul-de-sac, fully certain that her only witnesses on this early morning were the trees and the shrubs. Little did she realize that her neighbour Lilac Evans had long since been up and about, with Buddy at her side, waiting to discreetly follow her into the woods. Lilac had woken up with a start, in the early hours of the morning, with a sour taste in her mouth, an annoying feeling in her gut that made her feel as if something was terribly wrong, and her thoughts immediately gravitated towards her neighbour, Petty Wainthropp. Was the young lady in danger? Silly question! Of course she's in danger! But there was something in the air that morning, something so palpable, something so awful, that it made her feel that today was the day she needed to pay close attention to the young woman. Lilac had unfortunately never been able to help Mrs. Perkins, her previous next-door neighbour. The old woman had dropped down dead in the front yard, in front of Lilac herself, because of a dreadful paralysing fear, brought on by an extreme aversion to rats. She could, however, play her small little part in keeping a judicious eye on her next-door neighbour, her new neighbour, Petty Waincroft. Lilac had watched Petty with her frolicking ponytail bouncing at the back of her neck, running past her cottage. Petty appeared rather apprehensive this morning, more so than usual. Lilac wondered if the young lady could feel a sense of foreboding in the air like she could, which you could practically taste. Lilac had a grandmother who had long since passed away, who had been able to read tea leaves. Her grandmother had told her that Lilac had a gift of clairaudience, that she could develop, but Lilac had paid her grandmother's claim no heed. But now this heavy feeling of foreboding in her gut could not be dismissed. Was it some kind of psychic premonition, she wondered? She couldn't be sure. Lilac watched Petty Waincroft, looking nervously over her shoulders, back towards her cottage, and then at the road ahead of her, as if she was having second thoughts about going out this morning for her jog. Lilac waited for her energetic neighbour to jog past her cottage, but this morning she noticed that Petty Waincroft was a little bit out of sorts, and not as energetic as she usually was. But finally she disappeared at the end of the road. Lilac gingerly followed her close behind, with a bottle of mace tucked away neatly in her pocket. She walked towards the end of the cul-de-sac, with Buddy by her side, and as she ambled up the hill, she observed two dark silhouettes. They were two male figures, disappearing very cautiously into the woods. There was little doubt that they were following Petty Waincroft, with duplicitous intent. Everything about their mannerisms and movements told Lilac that these young men were unsavoury characters. Lilac gasped, for she noted in their hands they appeared to be carrying hunting rifles. They moved clandestinely through the trees, signalling to each other. They looked incredibly furtive. "I knew it! I just knew it! They're after that young lady. I've got to stop them. They can't hurt my new next-door neighbour." Lilac was in two minds about whether she should call the police or not, but the decision was taken out of her hands when, after fumbling around in her jacket pocket, she realised that she'd all but left her cell phone at home on the kitchen table. Running back to get it would take far too much time. By the time she got back to the cottage and called for help, Petty could potentially be dead. It must have been that Ryan, she thought. The visitor that she suspected was Petty's boyfriend, had arrived at Wispy Wind Cottage the other day to see Petty. Petty had not been remotely amused to see him, and had seemed rather paranoid that he might have been followed by unscrupulous men who wished to harm her by way of revenge. "Silly man," thought Lilac, shaking her head. "Silly, silly man. He must have inadvertently led those scoundrels right to Petty's doorstep. So much for changing her appearance with plastic surgery. They obviously know it's the woman they're looking for. I wouldn't be remotely surprised if they'd been following her around, establishing her daily routine." Lilac, who appreciated the urgency of Petty's plight, quickly stepped up her pace, with Buddy still on the lead, who seemed rather surprised at the speed they were going at, into the woods. But he was a good dog, and seemed to be behaving himself this morning. Lilac was out of breath by the time she heard the voices. With Buddy at her side, she beckoned for him to be quiet, and he obeyed. Lilac crouched behind a tree to eavesdrop on the conversation, and to get a better view of both men, who looked objectionably unpleasant, the kind of unwholesome, repugnant people you'd definitely not want to meet in a dark alley on a lonely night. They looked like villainous, degenerate gangsters that had ill intent.
"Hello there, Susan Nettles. It's good to see you. Been a long time, hasn't it?"
One of the men had Susan thrown onto the ground, lying flat on her back, with his heavy-weighted boot over her chest and his rifle pressed under her neck, while she stared up at him with terrified eyes.
"I have no idea who you are or what you want, but my name is Petty. I'm not the Susan that you speak of, and I've never ever changed my appearance before, nor have I ever been under the knife for plastic surgery. I'm telling you, you've got the wrong person. I don't know a Dirk Underwood, never heard of him before, and I'm not responsible for putting anybody in jail. I can't think what you're talking about, but you've clearly got the wrong person."
"Look at her, Kirk. Lies as if her pants are on fire. No wonder Dirk Underwood was taken in by her. If you must know, Susan, your lover boy led us straight to your cosy little cottage. What's his name again? Ah, yes, Ryan Wendell. Goodness gracious, that young man doesn't know when he's being followed, does he?
Ryan? You're talking about Ryan. He's an old friend of mine. He came to visit me the other day. But he's not a boyfriend of mine. We've never dated. We're just good friends, that's all."
"He was your boyfriend, lady. Now don't you lie to me. You went out with him for 8 years before you seduced Dirk Underwood. You fooled him, didn't you, by pretending to be his girl? But all the time you wanted to betray him because he killed your brother Simon. Isn't that right? Your brother Simon deserved to die. He messed Dirk Underwood around. It wasn't personal. Those are the rules of the cartel. The trouble is, young lady, when you mess with the likes of Dirk Underwood, you try to outsmart him. It's never going to work. He's too clever. We all are. We don't miss a trick. You hear that?
I can't think what you're talking about. You've got me confused with somebody else. I've never dated a Dirk Underwood before. And Ryan Wendell, I admit I know him. He's a good friend of mine, that's all. You must have your wires crossed somewhere along the line. Please let me go. You're hurting me. I can hardly breathe, with your boot all over my chest. Get off me, will you?"
For a moment Lilac saw a touch of doubt in the men's faces, and in that second she knew what she needed to do, to escalate their uncertainty. With a cocky assertiveness that was all bravado on her part, she boldly meandered through the trees, with Buddy at her side, who began to bark wildly at the two men, as if they were intruders that had broken into Lilac's cottage. Buddy did not like these two men one little bit. He could sense they were evil. Her golden retriever was snarling at them, baring his canine teeth in a threatening posture. One of the men was wearing a brown and black striped shirt, rolled up at the sleeves, along with a pair of matching chinos. He pointed his rifle at Lilac.
"I like dogs, ma'am, to an extent, but not yours. I don't like your dog. And if you don't get him to bloody shut up, I'll blow his brains out. Do you understand? Buddy, go home, will you? Go home, Buddy."
The dog immediately darted out of the grove of trees. Lilac had certainly trained him well.
"Put that thing down, young man, will you?" said Lilac, looking at his rifle. "I'm old enough to be your mother. Have you no respect for senior citizens? I'd like to know what you're doing with my daughter. Would you get your boot off her now? You're crushing her chest. You're hurting her. What the hell do you think you're doing with her? What has she ever done to you?" "Your daughter?" asked one of the men, raising a brow. "This is your daughter? Is this some joke, ma'am?" "Of course this is not a joke. She's my daughter.
Her name is Petty Wainthroft, although some people call us Waincroft, because people get confused, you see. It was Evans before she married that loser husband of hers, and they got divorced. She lives right next door to me at Wispy Wind Cottage, if you must know. We're very close, that's why we live close to each other. I don't know what you want with my daughter, but I overheard you talking about drugs. For your information, my young daughter has never taken a drug in her life. She's never had cosmetic surgery either to change her appearance. Can you not see she's got my nose? She's my daughter, and she's not called Susan Nettles. Never heard of that woman before.
You bloody fool, Kirk, said the other man, glaring at his hostile-looking companion, who Lilac privately thought had the most evil eyes she'd ever seen. His head was fully shaven, and he had a huge pair of biceps on him that were shown off by a white string vest he was wearing. His body was covered in impressive-looking tattoos.
Did you not check your facts, Kirk? It would be so typical of you to do this to us. You said you were absolutely certain that this woman was Susan Nettles. What if you got the wrong bloody person? What if you got it wrong? I am sure it's the right person. They're spinning us a yarn, the two of them. I don't think I got anything wrong. This is Susan Nettles. I know it is, even though it doesn't look like her.
Before Lilac could protest, she had also been thrown on the ground and was lying flat on her back, staring up in bemusement at the two men.
This is not your daughter, is it, ma'am? You're lying to us through your teeth. You're trying to protect this young lady,
said Kirk, pressing his heavy boot so hard on Lilac's chest that he squeezed all the oxygen out of her. Lilac felt no fear. She knew there was a very real possibility that these evil men would take them both out. She could tell they'd killed before. There was a hardness to them that left her in no uncertain doubt about that.
How about we kill them both, said Kirk. It's no string off our nose. I'm pretty certain this is Susan Nettles. I would put money on it, and if it isn't, too bad. That's what I say. As for this meddling old bat, well, she's surplus to requirements, isn't she? I say we get rid of them both and be done with it.
That's my mother you're talking about, said Petty. Please don't hurt her. She's done nothing wrong in this. Nothing.
Lilac could see Petty's eyes were filled with fear.
You can't kill her. You can't. Do you understand?
Kirk did not answer Susan. His face paled, growing as white as a sheet. His whole body began to tremble.
What is it, Kirk? What the hell is wrong with you?
Asked the other man, looking up at his friend's ashen face.
It's a bloody Bigfoot, Stan. He's standing over there between the trees, watching us. He's a bloody giant. Don't be ridiculous, Kirk. What the hell are you talking about? There's no such thing as Bigfoot. I'm telling you, over there, watching us in those trees. It's a Bigfoot. It's a Bigfoot. Bloody hell, said Stan, his mouth dropping open. You're right. It's a Bigfoot. What are you waiting for, Kirk? You saw it first. Shoot it, for God's sake. Shoot it.
Kirk was trembling as he tried to aim the rifle at the Bigfoot. He was filled with terror. Seconds later he began firing indiscriminately in a blaze of bullets, one after another, until there was nothing left in his rifle, and Stan did much the same. But every single one of those bullets missed the nimble creature, who simply bounced out of the way with an agility that was nothing short of incredulous. The Bigfoot could have been 9 foot to 10 foot tall. He had a strapping, ripped physique. He gave the two screaming men chase. Help! Help, came the voices of the men. Help! Help! Someone help me! Lilac had not moved an inch. She sat up on the ground, staring in bewilderment at the scene unfolding before her eyes. Petty was equally as bemused. Her mouth had dropped wide open, her eyes as wide as saucers. Both women were frozen in time, as if they were rooted by their derrieres, anchored to one spot in the ground. Everything happened so very quickly, at the speed of light. Kirk continued to scream, and then he did something really awful. He shoved his friend Stan onto the ground, so the man fell forwards into the Bigfoot's path, But the Bigfoot ran past Stan, and with an overlong hand he grabbed Kirk before the man could escape. Now Kirk was screaming as he looked up into the face of the Bigfoot.
Help! Somebody do something! Help! Please help!
He cried out.
He's going to kill me! Do you hear that? He's going to kill me! Someone help!
Kirk's cries fell on deaf ears, for no one cared about his plight. No one came to his help, for he had never helped anyone that he had lightly killed in the past. The Bigfoot grabbed him by the head, lifted him up in the air like a rag doll, and with one hand twisted the man's neck, so it dangled like the rabbits had done that Lilac had discovered hanging from a branch on her previous walk in the grove. Stan was trying desperately to run away. His eyes were round with terror as he saw the Bigfoot throwing the dead corpse of his friend onto the ground. He knew it was his turn. Stan was pleading with the Bigfoot. He'd picked up a stick off the ground and was waving it around in a threatening way, but the stick was pitifully small and did not intimidate the Bigfoot at all.
Please, don't come near me! Don't come near me! Don't you come near me! No! Don't come near me!
The Bigfoot just whisked him in the air and twisted his neck. He died so easily. The men were now dead on the forest floor, and the Bigfoot threw them both over his shoulders and turned around to look at both Lilac and Petty. What happened next startled the two women.
Don't worry, came the voice in their head. I've got this. These men can't hurt you now. I won't let anything hurt you. I'm the watcher. I look after the woods. I know what goes on here.
And with that, the Bigfoot simply glided away, while Lilac and Petty embraced each other.
"Thank you," said Petty. "Thank you for what you did, Lilac. You went out on a limb for me. I don't know how to thank you."
"I think it's a Bigfoot we need to thank, dear. Certainly not me. But I, for one, am very glad to see the back of those evil men. Hopefully you'll be able to live with more peace in your life, knowing that those two thugs are out of the way." 1 month later, Buddy barked excitedly as Lilac navigated her way to the front door. "Oh, Petty, it's you, dear. This is a lovely surprise. I'm so delighted to see you. Do come in." Lilac continued to call Susan her newly acquired name Petty, as no one in town knew who she really was, and Lilac and Petty had become close friends. Lilac kept the young woman's secrets safe. Susan bolted into the cottage. She looked excited.
"You're not going to believe it, Lilac. I can barely believe it myself. When I got the phone call, I was in absolute shock."
"What is it, dear? I'm intrigued."
"Mark Underwood is dead! He's dead, Lilac."
"You're kidding me. How on earth did that happen? That is wonderful news."
"He died of a stroke. They found him dead in his bed this morning. Do you realize what this means? I'm free, Lilac. I'm really free."
The two women embraced. Tears poured down Petty's cheeks. Coming to this quiet, unassuming town had really been written in the stars for her. She had already made so many friends. Tongues were no longer wagging, and now she could resume her relationship with Ryan Wendell, and her parents would be free, as the head of the dragon had now been cut off, which meant all the other parts connected to the dragon would wither away into obscurity, and would be interested in the likes of Susan Nettles no more. As for Stan and Kirk, who were Dirk Underwood's minions, they had met with a dreadful end. No signs of their bodies were ever recovered. Lilac and Petty regularly go for walks in the woodgrove. They haven't seen the Bigfoot again, but they have seen rabbits hanging from branches, and if they get close to the Bigfoot's quarry, they are showered with stones. Some things never change. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.